In the freezing winter of 1985, a large American black bear was slowly wandering through the dense, snow-covered forest of northern Georgia. This was a place of quiet beauty, where the only sounds were the whispering wind and the snapping of dry twigs. The bear was just doing what any normal wild bear would do, looking for food before the deepest parts of the winter set in. As this massive creature stepped over a fallen log, it saw something strange lying out on the forest floor. It was a large, heavy object that did not look like it belonged in the woods. Intrigued, the bear slowly wandered over to investigate. It sniffed the strange object, then began pawing at it, scratching the tough fabric with its sharp claws. Finally, with one powerful rip, the bear tore this strange object completely open. Immediately, a very strange, sweet, almost flowery smell filled the crisp mountain air. The bear did not know what this smell was, but it was highly enticing. Less than 10 minutes later, that wild bear would experience something that literally no other living thing on Earth has ever experienced. And that moment was just the beginning of one of the strangest, most bizarre stories that would eventually take the entire world by storm, leaving everyone who heard it completely speechless. Fast forward to early December of 1985 in the Chattahoochee National Forest in northern Georgia. A hunter was very carefully making his way through the thick stands of trees, trying to track a deer that he had spotted earlier. This hunter had been tracking the animal for over a mile, but it had been quite some time since he had seen any clear signs of it being nearby. As the hunter continued to creep along the forest floor, he became increasingly aware of just how loud each of his footsteps was. The ground all around him was completely covered in dry leaves, and every single step he took made a loud, sharp, crunching sound. The forest was so quiet that the noise felt deafening to him. Eventually, the hunter just came to a stop. He stood there in the silence, realizing that stalking this deer was totally pointless. He was basically scaring the animal away with the loud, crunching sounds of his boots before he could even get close enough to see it. But before he decided to just give up and head back to his vehicle, he figured he would walk just a little bit further to see what was over the next ridge. He pushed through a particularly dense area of brush, and then he saw a wide clearing up ahead. The very second he saw what was inside that clearing, he completely froze. He quickly took a step back into the safety of the brush and ducked down behind a large rock. In that clearing, he had spotted an animal. And it was definitely not a deer. It was a massive American black bear. Now, generally speaking, American black bears are not naturally aggressive towards human beings. They usually prefer to avoid people whenever they can. However, if you were to accidentally sneak up on a black bear like this hunter had just done, and you suddenly startled it, things could go very wrong. If a bear feels cornered or surprised, it might react by pouncing on you and ripping you to pieces. So this hunter was sitting there with his back pressed hard against the cold rock. He was gripping his rifle tightly across his chest, and his heart was pounding in his ears. He was desperately trying to figure out what he was going to do to get out of this situation safely. At first, he thought about just standing up and quietly walking away the way he came. But then, he remembered how loud those dry leaves were. Even though he had been lucky enough to walk in without alerting the bear, he was worried that walking out would make too much noise. The rustling leaves would definitely give away his position. So, the hunter started thinking about a second option. What if he just stood up and started shooting at the bear? But he knew there was a major problem with that plan. He was carrying a deer hunting rifle. A deer rifle is not nearly powerful enough to quickly and cleanly take down a massive black bear. If he fired and only wounded the animal, there was a very high chance the bear would turn on him and maul him before he could reload. As the hunter lay there behind the rock, running through these dangerous scenarios, he suddenly realized something strange. He had not heard the bear make a single sound. Bears are noisy animals, and their regular breathing is so loud you can hear it from a distance. But he heard nothing. So, the hunter carefully stood up and peered back into the clearing. When he spotted the bear again, he realized it was dead, slumped forward on the ground. The hunter felt a massive wave of relief and stepped out to get a closer look. Up close, something struck him as incredibly odd. This bear was far too young to have died of natural causes, yet there were no visible injuries, no bullet holes, and no signs of a struggle. It had just randomly dropped dead. The hunter did not spend too much time thinking about it, figuring there had to be some logical explanation. With one last look, he turned and began the long walk back to his truck, completely unaware that the truth was anything but logical. To find out what actually happened to that bear, we have to go back in time. We have to go back about 3 months before the hunter found the body, specifically to the night of September 10th, 1985. At around 11:30 that night, 2 pilots were flying a small 6-seater Cessna airplane high over northern Georgia. They were making their way north, heading towards Tennessee. It was a very dark night, and the flight seemed completely routine and peaceful. But as these 2 pilots flew along, they suddenly heard a voice message crackling over their radio. It was a transmission they were definitely never supposed to hear. The voices on the radio sounded like other pilots who were communicating with each other. And what they were talking about was highly alarming. They were discussing how they were currently following a small Cessna airplane. They specified that this Cessna was currently flying over northern Georgia. Now, radio traffic like this can only really be intercepted if your radio is physically close to the person doing the transmitting. Knowing this, the 2 pilots in the Cessna knew that whoever was talking about following that plane had to be talking about them. Normally, if you are a pilot and you overhear a radio transmission saying another plane is tailing you, you might contact them. You might radio back and ask what is going on, or ask why they are following you. The co-pilot of this little Cessna wanted to do exactly that. He reached for the radio, ready to ask some questions. But before he could, the main pilot grabbed his arm and stopped him. The main pilot looked at him and said that he actually knew exactly why someone would be following them. And then he delivered some incredibly shocking news. He told the co-pilot that they were both going to have to jump out of the plane right now. Before the co-pilot could even process what he was hearing, the main pilot reached forward and engaged the Cessna autopilot system. The autopilot would keep the plane flying in a completely straight line, at a constant speed and a constant altitude. It would keep flying this way until a pilot took back control, or until it ran out of fuel and crashed. Once the autopilot was set, the main pilot turned to the co-pilot and gestured for him to follow him into the back cabin. This was the main body of the aircraft where all of their luggage was stored. The co-pilot was completely confused and terrified. He had no idea what was happening or why they were suddenly preparing to abandon a perfectly good airplane in the middle of the night. But he was so panicked that he just followed the main pilot anyway. The 2 men climbed over the front seats and squeezed into the small rear cabin. Immediately, the main pilot began grabbing heavy pieces of luggage and strapping parachutes onto them. As he worked furiously, he shouted over the engine noise, telling the co-pilot to open up the side door of the plane. The co-pilot was hesitant, but he did what he was told. He reached over and slid the heavy door open. The moment the door slid back, a massive rush of freezing night air blasted into the cabin. The sound of the howling wind was absolutely deafening. It was so loud that the 2 men could no longer hear each other speak at all. Without hesitation, the main pilot began picking up the heavy bags of luggage and pushing them straight out of the open door, sending them plummeting down into the pitch-black darkness below. The co-pilot, seeing what was happening, decided to help. He grabbed the remaining bags and helped shove them out into the night sky. Once all the luggage was gone, the main pilot grabbed a parachute and shoved it into the co-pilot's hands, gesturing for him to put it on. The co-pilot struggled to strap the parachute onto his body in the freezing, windy cabin. As he did, the main pilot quickly strapped on his own parachute. Just as the co-pilot finished securing his straps, the main pilot did something unexpected. He reached out and pushed the co-pilot right out of the open door of the plane. The co-pilot tumbled out into the dark night, and a second later, the main pilot jumped out right after him. They had completely abandoned their airplane, leaving it flying on autopilot through the night sky, destined to eventually crash somewhere in the mountains while they drifted down to the ground below. Now, we have to fast forward about 5 hours to a quiet suburb in Knoxville, Tennessee. An 85-year-old man named Fred Myers was just waking up. Fred was a man of strict habit. He always woke up long before the sun came up, and this morning was no different. His morning routine was incredibly important to him. He would wake up, get dressed, wash and shave his face, and then sit down to read the morning newspaper. This routine was not just a preference for Fred. It was actually a crucial way for him to manage his life. Recently, Fred had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, which is a progressive disease that slowly destroys a person's memory and cognitive abilities. Having a set, predictable routine every single morning helped Fred cope with his symptoms. It allowed him to go on autopilot, moving from one task to the next without getting confused or lost in his own home. But on this particular morning, something was about to happen that would shatter his routine and leave him more confused than he had ever been in his entire life. Fred had made his way into his bathroom. He had washed his face and applied shaving cream, and he was in the middle of shaving his face when he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. He looked through the bathroom window that faced his driveway. Outside, in the darkness, there was a large, strange shape lying on the concrete. Because it was still so dark outside, Fred could not quite make out what it was. Feeling curious and a little bit uneasy, Fred put his razor down. He walked out of the bathroom and went over to a window that gave him a much better view of the driveway. He leaned forward and pressed his face near the glass, peering out into the early morning gloom. What he saw out there was so bizarre that he could hardly believe his eyes. Lying right there on his concrete driveway was a massive, fully deployed parachute. And tangled up in the lines of that parachute was a dead man. This man was the main pilot of the Cessna airplane. After he had pushed the co-pilot out of the plane and jumped out himself, things had gone horribly wrong. When he pulled his ripcord, his main parachute failed to deploy properly. Or, if it did deploy, it did not inflate with air. Realizing he was falling to his death, the pilot had desperately pulled the cord for his reserve parachute. But he was already falling too fast, and the reserve parachute did not have enough time to inflate and slow him down. The pilot had slammed into Fred Myers' driveway at terminal velocity. The impact had caused catastrophic internal injuries, and he had died within just a couple of minutes of hitting the ground. Fred stood at his window, completely stunned. He was so confused by the sight of a dead parachutist in his driveway that he did not even know what to think. Without saying a single word to himself, he turned away from the window, walked over to his telephone, and called the emergency police dispatcher with shaving cream still on his face. When the police arrived at Fred's house that morning, they were expecting to see a dead recreational skydiver on Fred's property. But when they walked up the driveway and saw the dead man for themselves, they knew right away this was not some recreational skydiver. He actually looked more like a soldier. He was wearing a bulletproof vest over some camouflage fatigues, and he had night vision goggles strapped to his head. But the dead man's shoe choice made the police think this guy could not possibly have been military. On this guy's feet were not military-style combat boots like you would expect with the rest of his gear. Instead, he was wearing loafers, specifically black Gucci loafers, which were very expensive designer shoes. The police were completely baffled by this strange combination. Why would someone dressed for a combat operation be wearing high-end designer shoes? They began to wonder who this mysterious man was and what he had been doing in the sky over Tennessee. It did not take very long for the police to identify the dead man. His name was Andrew Thornton, and he was a 40-year-old man. As they began digging into his background, they discovered that Andrew had a very interesting history. He had actually served in the United States Army as a highly trained paratrooper. This explained why he knew how to jump out of planes with precision and courage. But after his military service, his life took a very dark turn. He had actually worked as a police officer for a while, but eventually he decided to use his skills for a different career path. He became a big-time smuggler of illegal goods, working with powerful drug cartels. The police also quickly connected Andrew to the Cessna airplane. Not long after Andrew's body was found in the driveway, the Cessna was discovered. It had crashed directly into a rugged mountainside in North Carolina, completely destroyed. With the plane located, the police began searching for the missing co-pilot. They knew from the flight records and initial reports that there had been a second person on board. It did not take them long to track him down. The co-pilot had survived his parachute jump, landing safely in a different area. When the police questioned him, they quickly realized that this man was not a mastermind smuggler. He was actually just a victim of Andrew Thornton. The co-pilot explained that Andrew had invited him on what he claimed was a simple vacation. Andrew had told him they were just going to fly down to the Bahamas for a nice, relaxing trip. The co-pilot had no idea that the flight was actually a massive drug smuggling run. He told the police that when they were flying over Georgia, everything suddenly fell apart. Andrew had suddenly started barking orders at him, telling him they were being followed. The co-pilot said he was so completely terrified and confused when Andrew opened the plane door and started throwing luggage out that he just did whatever he was told. He had helped push the bags out because he was in a state of pure panic. And then, before he could even understand what was happening, Andrew had shoved a parachute into his hands and pushed him out of the plane. The police believed the co-pilot's story. He had no criminal record, and his absolute terror seemed entirely genuine. Because of this, they decided not to charge him with any crimes. Instead, they focused their attention on finding the luggage that had been thrown out of the plane. The co-pilot was able to give them a general idea of where they had been flying when they dropped the bags, which pointed them directly toward the dense forests of northern Georgia. The police launched a massive search operation, scouring the rugged terrain. Over the next several weeks, they managed to recover several of the heavy duffel bags. But as they kept searching, they realized that they were still missing some of the cargo. They knew that these bags contained highly dangerous illegal materials, and they were desperate to get them off the streets. They began working with local news outlets, asking the public for their help. They put out announcements across northern Georgia, warning people that if they came across any abandoned duffel bags or parachutes in the woods, they should not touch them and should call the police immediately. Meanwhile, in late November of 1985, a large American black bear was living a typical life in the Chattahoochee National Forest, which mostly meant wandering around looking for something to eat. On this particular day, the bear spotted one of the heavy duffel bags that Andrew Thornton had pushed out of his plane. Intrigued, the bear tore open the fabric, releasing a sweet, flowery smell that filled the forest air. The bag was packed with bricks of pure cocaine. The bear began sniffing and eating the white powder, and it ended up consuming an enormous amount of the drug. The massive overdose gave the bear a sudden burst of energy. After sprinting about 100 yards at top speed, every major organ system inside its body shut down all at once, and it collapsed dead in a small clearing. 2 weeks later, the deer hunter discovered the dead bear in the clearing. When he returned home, he casually mentioned finding the bear and the nearby duffel bag to a friend. The friend, who had been following the local news about the dead smuggler in the Gucci loafers and the missing bags, immediately realized the connection and called the police. Authorities rushed to the forest and found the empty duffel bag, which was supposed to be filled with cocaine. Suspecting the bear had eaten it, they decided to bring the cold body of the bear back to perform an autopsy. The medical examiner opened the stomach and found it packed to the absolute brim with pure cocaine, confirming the bear died of a massive overdose. Rather than cremating the bear, the examiner decided to have it taxidermied and donated it to the recreation area. From there, the bear went on a wild journey over the next 2 decades. It was stolen, sold to a pawn shop, and eventually bought by famous country singer Waylon Jennings. Today, the bear resides at the Kentucky Fun Mall in Lexington, Kentucky, wearing a sign that reads "Cocaine Bear." It stands as a bizarre monument to a smuggler's greed and the innocent wild animal caught in the crossfire. It leaves behind a haunting reminder of how human crime can seep deep into the natural world, forever altering things in the most unpredictable ways. It is a story that is filled with unbelievable tragedy and dark comedy, highlighting the strange and unpredictable connections of our world. A paratrooper turned smuggler falls to his death, while an innocent wild bear becomes an immortal symbol of human excess. We are left with a quiet, haunting reminder of the real cost of human crime, starting with a desperate jump in the night and ending with a silent bear in a forest clearing, showing us that our actions have consequences far beyond what we can see. A desperate jump in the night created one of the strangest true stories in American history. But it's not the only unbelievable case we've covered. If you're curious what happened next in another real-life mystery, the next story is waiting for you right now. Michael DiPolito grew up in a place that was tough by any standard. We're talking about a rough neighborhood in South Philadelphia. This was the kind of place where things like violence, drugs, and prostitution weren't shocking events you saw on the news, they were just part of the background noise of everyday life. And like a lot of kids in that environment, Michael got pulled into it early. His parents were alcoholics, and soon so was he. It didn't stop there. He developed a serious drug addiction, and to pay for it, he started selling drugs himself. School just wasn't a priority for him. He eventually dropped out of high school, and it wasn't long after that he found himself with nowhere to go. He became homeless, living out on the streets of the city he grew up in. At night, he'd find abandoned buildings to sleep in, just trying to stay warm and get through to the next day. In 1993, while he was still in this situation in South Philadelphia, the law caught up with him for the first time. He was arrested and charged with possession of an unknown drug, as well as the intent to sell it. The court records don't say what the drug was, but it didn't really matter. Michael was given a court date, and he just didn't show up. A warrant was put out for his arrest. Somehow, Michael managed to stay off the radar. He evaded the police for years. By 1997, he decided he needed a complete change of scenery. He fled South Philly and made his way down to South Florida, landing in a town called Boca Raton. But his old life had a way of following him. Shortly after he arrived, he was arrested for a second time. This time, he had offered an undercover police officer $15 in exchange for sex. He pleaded guilty to soliciting prostitution, but he was released not long after. A year after that arrest, his past came knocking again. A former girlfriend named Karen Tan sued him. She claimed he was the father of her son and that he owed her child support. Karen wasn't just making it up, she had a DNA test to prove it. But, just like with his drug charge, Michael simply didn't show up for court. After a while, Karen must have realized it was a losing battle, and she gave up and dropped the lawsuit. For Michael, this was probably a huge relief. At the time, he was working through a temp agency, making barely any money. He knew he couldn't afford child support. So after that lawsuit was dropped, Michael decided he needed to find a way to make some real money. And in his search for a better opportunity, he somehow crossed paths with associates of the Bonanno crime family. Now, the Bonanno family is one of the 5 infamous families that dominate organized crime in the United States. They are, quite literally, the Italian mafia. When they met Michael, they saw something in him. He was charismatic, a natural talker. They liked him, and they offered him a job, an illegal one, but a very lucrative one. They gave him a role inside one of their so-called boiler rooms. A boiler room isn't a literal room with a boiler. It's a place where a group of fraudsters work the phones using high-pressure sales tactics to steal money from people. The way it usually works is a fraudster will cold call someone, maybe an elderly person, and tell them about this incredible get-rich-quick investment opportunity. But they'd always say, "You have to invest right now, or you'll miss out." When the unsuspecting victim agrees and wires over their money, the fraudster just keeps it. Michael turned out to be incredibly good at this. He was a natural salesman, and he could trick people into giving him their money with ease. And so, it didn't take long for him to realize he could make a lot more if he wasn't just an employee. He wanted to be the boss. He figured if he started his own boiler room, his commission on the money he stole could be much, much higher. So, pretty abruptly, he left the mafia's operation. We don't really know how the Bonanno family reacted to one of their guys just up and leaving to start a competing scam. Michael went on to set up not one, but two of his own boiler room scams right there in South Florida. By 2002, he had managed to steal $155,000, but he had spent almost all of it. He lived a lavish lifestyle of fancy hotels, expensive cars, and phone sex lines. The good times, however, were not going to last. In 2002, the police finally caught on to Michael's scams. They raided both of his boiler rooms, and Michael was arrested for a third time. And this time, he didn't skip his court date. He stood trial, was found guilty, and was sentenced to 2 years in prison and an incredible 28 years of probation. He was also ordered to pay back every single cent of the $155,000 he had stolen. Michael would only end up serving 7 months of his 2-year sentence, but those 7 months changed him forever. He absolutely hated prison. He hated every single second of it. During the long, sleepless nights he spent lying awake in his cell, he made a promise to himself. He swore that when he got out, when he was finally released, he would never, ever come back. And so, when he was released in 2003, he was a man on a mission. The first thing he did was enter a sobriety program. He started going to the gym every single morning, getting his body and mind right. He also started studying for his GED. That's a high school equivalency test because remember, he had never gotten his high school diploma. A couple of months later, he passed the test and earned his GED. Then, he started a legitimate business. It was a digital marketing firm he called Mad Money Inc. Over the next several years, Michael did his absolute best to stay on the straight and narrow. He focused on his sobriety, his health, and his business. And for the most part, he succeeded. By 2008, he was still sober, though he'd had a few setbacks along the way. His business, Mad Money Inc., was doing very well, earning him nearly $100,000 a year. But his personal life was about to get very messy. Michael had gotten married back in 2007 to his longtime girlfriend, Maria Luongo. Maria had stood by him through everything, including his time in jail. But that year, in 2008, Michael, who was now 38 years old, cheated on her. He met a 26-year-old real estate agent named Dalia Muhammad at a Starbucks. What was probably intended to be a quick, meaningless fling turned into something more. Michael and Dalia fell in love, and they fell hard. Once Michael knew his feelings were real, he went to his wife Maria and told her everything. He told her he was in love with someone else, and he wanted a divorce. Just 3 days after the divorce was finalized, Michael and Dalia went down to the courthouse and got married. The newlyweds moved into a brand new condo that Michael had bought for them in Boynton Beach, a beautiful town in South Florida. And for a little while, their life seemed perfect. They knew the way they got together was outrageous, meeting and marrying so quickly, but they didn't care. They got along great and were excited to start their future together. But that perfect life was not going to last. On the evening of the 12th of March 2009, only about a month after they had gotten married, Michael and Dahlia were at home in their condo. Suddenly, they heard a knock on the front door. Michael went to see who it was. He opened the door, and to his complete surprise, his probation officer was standing on his doorstep. And behind the probation officer was a whole group of police officers. Before Michael could even ask what was going on, his probation officer told him that they had received an anonymous phone call. The caller had tipped them off that Michael was selling steroids, ecstasy pills, and other drugs out of his condo. Michael was stunned. He told the probation officer there was no way that was true. He insisted he wasn't selling any drugs. He was sober. He wasn't involved in that life anymore. Eventually, seeing that they were serious, Michael just stepped aside. He said, "Please, come in. Search my condo. I have nothing to hide." So, that's what they did. The police came inside and searched the entire place. But just as Michael had said, they didn't find anything. And so, they left. After the police were gone, Michael and Dahlia just stood there in their condo, completely dumbfounded. What just happened? Who would make a call like that? But instead of trying to figure it all out right then and there, they decided the best thing to do was just to get out of the condo for the night. They packed a couple of bags, left their home, which was a total mess from the police search, and went to stay at a nice hotel. They tried to put the strange event behind them and just have a nice night together. The next morning, they got up and headed down to the hotel parking lot. As they were walking toward their car, they saw a familiar sight. Standing around Michael's car was his probation officer, along with several other police officers. Michael and Dahlia looked at each other in disbelief. What is going on? They rushed over to the car, and before they could even start pleading their innocence, Michael's probation officer held up a hand. He told Michael that they had received another anonymous call. This time, the caller said that Michael was selling drugs out of his vehicle, and they needed to search it. Michael was just beside himself. He couldn't believe this was happening again. But what could he do? He told them to go ahead and search the car. He said there was nothing in there. And so, the police opened up his car and tore it apart, looking for anything illegal. And once again, they found nothing. Over the next couple of weeks, this was the only thing Michael and Dahlia could talk about. Who was making these anonymous calls? Why was someone claiming Michael was selling drugs from his condo and his car? It just didn't make any sense. They wanted to believe it was all just some big, crazy mistake. But, in the back of their minds, they both knew about Michael's very checkered past. They thought about his dealings with the mafia and all the people he had ripped off in his boiler room scams. They started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, someone from his past was looking for revenge, trying to get him arrested and sent back to jail. Fast forward to March 29th. This was 17 days after that first raid on their condo. That night, Michael and Dahlia had been out to dinner at a restaurant. When they left and walked out to the parking lot, they were met with the same unbelievable scene. Standing around Michael's car were several police officers, clearly waiting for him. This time, they didn't even need to ask why the police were there. Michael and Dahlia walked over to them and just started pleading. They told the officers that this had to be a setup. They insisted they didn't have any drugs in the car. They begged the police to understand that someone was doing this to them. But this time, when the police searched his car, they would find something. After a thorough search of Michael's car, the police found a small bag of cocaine. It was stuck inside of a cigarette carton, which was tucked away underneath the spare tire in the trunk. When Michael saw the officer pull the bag of cocaine out, he just broke down. He started to cry. He knew, even though the drugs were not his, and even though he hadn't put them there, that he was going to jail. He was on probation. A possession charge would be a clear violation, and he would be sent right back to prison. He just stood there crying, pleading with the police, swearing that the cocaine was not his. Meanwhile, Dahlia was watching all of this unfold. And for a moment, she started to second-guess everything. Was Michael lying? Was he actually selling drugs and had been lying to her this whole time? But then she looked at her husband. He was crying hysterically, and he looked so sincere, so genuinely terrified. And in that moment, she decided she believed him. She was convinced he had to be telling the truth. So pretty soon, she was standing right there beside Michael, also pleading with the police. She told them to let him go, that this was obviously a setup. Amazingly, the police officers seemed to be listening. They were already aware of the 2 previous false tip-offs about Michael. They told Michael and Dahlia that they did think the situation was pretty suspicious. Someone keeps calling in about you selling drugs, and now, suddenly, drugs magically appear in your car. It seemed too convenient. So, the officers told them what they were going to do. They said they were going to confiscate the cocaine, but they were not going to arrest Michael. They told them to go home, be safe, and to call them immediately if they saw or heard anything strange. And they promised they would start an investigation to figure out who was making all of these anonymous calls. Michael and Dahlia were so relieved they could hardly believe it. But at the same time, they were also terrified. It was clear now that whoever was trying to get Michael in trouble was willing to break into his property to do it. What was stopping them from breaking into their condo and planting drugs there too? After the police left, Michael and Dahlia jumped in their car and sped back to their condo. They went inside and searched the entire place from top to bottom. They were looking for any sign that someone had recently been inside, or for any more drugs or anything else illegal that might have been planted. After a long search, they found nothing. So they locked all their doors, shut all their windows, closed all the blinds, and just prayed. They prayed that the police would be able to quickly find out who was doing this to them and make it stop. But over the next few months, the police didn't figure out who the anonymous caller was. And that was because the caller had stopped calling. The phone calls just ended. And for a little while, Michael and Dahlia started to believe that the whole terrifying ordeal was finally over. They slowly returned to their normal lives. But on the 5th of August 2009, roughly 4 months after the cocaine had been found in Michael's car, the anonymous caller would come back with a vengeance. On that morning, at around 5:45 a.m., Dahlia left the condo. Michael was still in bed, asleep. She headed out to her local gym to get a workout in. Around 6:30 inches the morning, she stepped off the treadmill and checked her phone. She saw she had a missed call from a number she didn't recognize. The number had also left her a voicemail. So, she called her voicemail and put the phone to her ear. As she listened to the message, her heart started to race. It was a Boynton Beach detective. He was telling her that there had been some sort of incident at her condo and that she needed to come back right away. Terrified, Dahlia grabbed her things and ran out of the gym. She got into her car and immediately called the number back. When the detective picked up, she tried to get more information out of him. What kind of incident? What happened? But the detective would only say that it involved her husband, Michael, and that he would explain everything when she got back to the condo. In a total state of shock, Dahlia started her car, sped out of the parking lot, and headed home. When she turned onto her street and saw her condo, she slammed on the brakes. The entire area was a chaotic scene. In front of her condo were multiple police cars, their lights flashing. Police officers were walking all around the property. Yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the front of her home. And inside that taped-off area, there were crime scene photographers taking pictures of her condo. As Dahlia sat there in her car at the end of the street, just staring at this unbelievable scene, one of the Boynton Beach police officers saw her. He walked up to her car, and after confirming that she was Dahlia DiPolito, he told her to leave her car right where it was and to come with him. Dahlia knew, obviously, that something terrible had happened, but she still didn't know exactly what. She put her car in park, got out, and began walking with the police officer. He led her toward a small group of 3 people who were standing right in front of her property. It turned out one of them was the detective who had called her on the phone. As soon as that detective saw Dahlia approaching, he walked over to her. And then, very matter-of-factly, he told her that someone had called in a disturbance at their condo. He said that shots were fired, and unfortunately, her husband, Michael, was dead. Dahlia became totally hysterical. An officer gently led her away from the scene and into a nearby police car. They drove her to the police station, sat her down in an interrogation room, and began asking her questions about her husband. The detective said to her, "Look, I know you just found this out, but we have to figure out what happened. There's a killer on the loose, and we need to find this person and stop them." At first, the conversation was mostly just Dahlia crying while the detective tried to calm her down, but eventually she started talking. She told the detective all about the anonymous caller who kept phoning the police and claiming Michael was selling drugs. She told him how she and Michael suspected that the caller was probably connected to someone from his past. Maybe someone from the mafia, or maybe one of the victims from his boiler room scams. She said it could be any number of people that Michael had wronged over the years. The detective took diligent notes, listening patiently to everything Dahlia said. Then, during a break in the conversation, he looked at her and said, "Okay, it's time to get serious. I need to know if you know this guy." Dahlia, who had been looking down at the table, looked up, confused about what he was talking about, and then the door to the interrogation room opened. A huge man in handcuffs walked into the room. An officer was yelling, "Come here! Bring this guy in here! Get over here." "Do you know who this guy is?" Dahlia looked at the man and said, "Never seen him before." The officer asked the man, "Do you know her?" The man looked at Dahlia. An officer said, "Put your head up and look at her." The man said, "I've never seen her before." The officer then asked him, "What were you doing coming out of her house?" Then he ordered for the man to be taken out of the room. It would turn out Dahlia was lying. She knew exactly who that man was. The truth was, almost immediately after marrying Michael 6 months earlier, she had stolen $200,000 from him. But apparently, that wasn't enough for her. She wanted the rest of his money, and she wanted his condo too. So, she had been the anonymous caller all along. She was the one who kept calling the police, tipping them off that Michael was selling drugs out of the condo and out of his car. She was the one who planted the bag of cocaine in the back of his car. She wanted him to get arrested because she knew that since he was on probation, he would go back to jail for a really long time and she would get everything. But when her efforts failed and Michael didn't get arrested and sent back to jail, Dahlia moved on to Plan B. She reached out to one of her ex-boyfriends and asked him a chilling question. She asked him if he knew any hitmen that could murder her husband. At first, the ex-boyfriend didn't think she was serious, but she kept asking him about it. She started offering to pay for it. She was making it very clear that she wasn't joking around. So the ex-boyfriend basically told her no, he didn't know any hitmen. And then he hung up the phone and called the Boynton Beach Police Department. He told them everything about Dahlia and her plan to hire a hitman to kill her husband, Michael. When the police found out about this plot, they immediately had one of their undercover agents pose as a hitman. They set up a meeting with Dahlia. That undercover agent was the huge guy in handcuffs who was just led into the interrogation room with her. Dahlia had gone to meet this fake hitman. She got into his car, and there was a hidden camera in the back seat filming her the entire time. She was caught on camera saying she wanted to kill her husband. She gave money to the undercover agent as a down payment. Then, just as she was about to get out of the car, the agent turned to her. He said, "Are you sure you want to do this? Because as soon as you leave this car, it's done. I am going to kill Michael, and you can't stop it." Dahlia's reaction was captured on film. She said, "It's not changing. No." There's no positive 5,000% sure. She went on to say, "No, when I say I'm gonna do something, I'm gonna do it. Like as soon as he told me about getting the money from you, I went and I grabbed it right away. Like we were good to go. Like with me, you're not gonna have a problem. You're not gonna have an issue." So the Boynton Beach Police Department now had all this information. They knew exactly what Dahlia thought was going to happen. And they decided they could use this information to set her up in the most elaborate way possible. And as it just so happened, the very popular true crime TV show, Cops, was filming in the area at that time. So the police department allowed Cops to be a part of this elaborate setup. They got to film everything. So on the morning of August 5th, Dahlia got up and left her condo at 5:45 a.m. She headed to the gym, believing in her mind that the hitman would be coming to her condo right after she left. She thought he would break in and shoot her husband twice in the head because that was the plan they had agreed on, the plan that was captured on film. As soon as the police who were monitoring the condo saw her leave, they rushed in. They knocked on the door and got Michael to come downstairs. Michael had absolutely no idea that his wife was trying to have him killed. He came to the door, totally confused, but he went with the officers. They ushered him off to the police station for his safety. Then, for about the next hour, the police set up a very convincing fake crime scene right in front of the condo. Once everything was in place, that's when the detective called Dahlia and left her that voicemail saying there had been an incident and she needed to come back. A couple of minutes later, when Dahlia called him back and said she was on her way, that's when the TV crews for the Cops show set up their cameras in the bushes and got ready to film what happened next. The detective's words to her were recorded. "Listen, we had a report of a disturbance at your house and there were shots fired." Dahlia asked, "Is your husband Michael okay?" And the detective delivered the line, "I'm sorry to tell you, ma'am, he's been killed." Back in the interrogation room, after the fake hitman was pulled out and Dahlia had denied knowing him, the detective just stared at her in total silence for a minute. And then he broke the news. He told her he knew all about her murder-for-hire plot and that she was going to jail. He told her, "You're under arrest." That's an undercover police officer. Everything has been recorded. You were photographed in the convertible when you sat in his car in front of CBS. She started to deny it, saying, "I didn't do anything." The detective cut her off. "You're going to jail. Don't tell me you didn't do anything. You're going to jail today. As soon as I'm done, they're going to come in here and handcuff you and take you to the Palm Beach County Jail. We're going to book you for solicitation of first-degree murder on your husband. Your husband is well and alive." Dahlia's response was a disbelieving, "Oh, yes. Thank God." The detective continued, "Thank God. He doesn't want to see you." After Dahlia was arrested, while she was still sitting in that interrogation room, the Boynton Beach Police Department made a special point of walking her husband, Michael, past the open door so she could see him. Her reaction was caught on tape. "Oh my God, he's alive! Come here, please. Come here, please. Come here. Come here, please. Come here." "Why not?" "I heard you, Mike. Come here, please. Come here." Dahlia was initially sentenced to 20 years in prison for what she had done. But after a retrial, which was granted because of jury bias in her first trial, her sentence was reduced to 16 years. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In 2005, a man named Eric Martin was working his shift at a paper mill in Maine. He'd been at that same mill for 20 years, a long time. It was a normal day, and he was reaching up to get something off a high shelf when he felt a sharp, sudden pain in his back. It was bad. He had slipped a number of discs, and the injury was severe enough that it completely changed his life. The doctors told him he wasn't going to be able to work anymore. He was going to be on disability. And just like that, after 2 decades of the same routine, Eric was out of a job. His wife, Shelley Martin, hadn't been working at the time. She was raising their family. But with Eric's income gone, she knew she had to find a job, and fast. It wasn't easy, since she'd been out of the workforce for a long time. But through some connections, she managed to land a position in her old hometown, a small rural community in Maine called Palmyra. When I say small, I mean really small. We're talking about maybe 1,200 people living there. It was the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, surrounded by miles and miles of dense forest. The Martins also had a 17-year-old daughter named Chelsea. Understandably, she wasn't thrilled about the idea of leaving her friends and her school to move to a tiny town in the middle of nowhere. But the family didn't have a choice. Palmyra was the only place they could afford to live on their new, much tighter budget. But there was a silver lining. Because the cost of living was so much lower in Palmyra, they were actually able to get a bigger piece of property than what they had before. They found this beautiful old farmhouse that sat on a huge plot of land, several acres of it. The catch was, it was incredibly isolated. To even get to the house, you had to drive down a long, bumpy access road that led to their own private driveway. And once you were on the property, if you looked in any direction, all you could see was a 360-degree view of thick, dark woods. There were no hiking trails, no other houses in sight. It was just them and the forest. So, even though nobody was particularly excited about the move, they packed up their lives and headed to the new farmhouse. As they were unloading the truck, Eric picked up one of his many rifles. Eric came from a long line of hunters. It was more than a hobby for him, it was a huge part of his identity. He loved being out in the woods, and he had a whole collection of guns he used for hunting. But as he started to carry a rifle into the house, Shelley stopped him. She said, "Oh no, we're not keeping the guns in the house." This had always been a point of conflict in their marriage. Shelley just never felt comfortable having firearms inside the home, especially with their daughter living there. She told Eric, "You have a barn. You can put your guns in the barn." After some discussion, Eric finally agreed. He went out to the barn with his son Sean, who had come over to help them with the move. Together, they built a heavy-duty gun case for all of Eric's rifles. They made it solid and secure. They put the case inside the barn, locked the case itself, and then locked the barn door. The guns were definitely safe and secure out there, but they were also not easy to get to in a hurry. Over that first year living in the farmhouse, Eric and Shelley settled into a new routine. At the end of each day, they would make coffee and go sit out on the front porch together. They'd just sit there, sipping their coffee and talking, looking out over their front yard and the big open field that stretched out towards the tree line. It was a quiet, peaceful ritual that they both came to look forward to every single night. Fast forward almost exactly 1 year, it was early 2006. Eric and Shelley were on their front porch, having their nightly coffee, just chatting like they always did. The sun had gone down, and it was getting dark. As they sat there, Shelley noticed something. Way out at the edge of the woods, she saw a light. To understand what she was seeing, you have to picture the layout of their property. Right in front of the porch was a gravel area where they parked their cars. About 20 meters or so to the left was the big barn. Straight ahead from the porch was the huge, open field. It was like a grazing area with no trees. And then, hundreds of meters away, at the far end of that field, was the beginning of that dense, dark forest. The light Shelley saw was way out there, at the tree line. She described it as a pulsating light. It didn't look like headlights from a car, and besides, there was no road out there. It was just the edge of the woods. Eric saw it too, and his first thought was that it was a poacher. Someone was on his property, hunting illegally. He was not happy about it. He called for his son, Sean, who happened to be staying the night. He brought Sean outside and pointed toward the tree line. He asked him, "Hey, do you think that's a poacher down there?" Sean looked and said he wasn't sure, but it could be. Eric decided he wanted to go down there and tell whoever it was to get off his land. He asked Sean to come with him. Their plan was simple. They would just walk to the edge of the property and yell out, "Hey, this is private property. You need to leave." So the two of them started walking across the big, open field, heading straight for the distant tree line. As they got closer, they noticed that the pulsating lights began to fade. The lights seemed to be retreating back into the woods, deeper into the darkness. By the time Eric and Sean reached the edge of the forest, the lights were completely gone. Even though they were pretty sure the poacher had left, they decided to be thorough. They thought, just to be sure, let's walk a little ways into the woods and keep yelling. That way, whoever it was would definitely get the message. So they stepped into the forest. It was pitch black under the canopy of trees. The woods were very dense, with lots of low-hanging branches. It wasn't an easy place to walk. There were no paths or trails at all. They walked maybe 10 or 15 meters into the darkness, continuing to call out that this was private land. And then they both stopped. They heard a sound. It sounded like someone or something was walking parallel to them, maybe 15 meters away, off to their left. They could hear the crunch of leaves and the snapping of twigs. They both froze and looked in that direction, but they couldn't see anything in the dark. They didn't want to take any chances. They didn't know if they were being stalked by a mountain lion or some other predator. Eric and Sean looked at each other, and without saying much, they decided it was time to get out of there. The lights were gone, and they didn't like the idea of whatever was making that noise being so close to them in the dark. They turned around and quickly made their way back to the farmhouse. About a month went by after that strange night. It was now spring, and the first really nice weekend after a long, dark Maine winter had finally arrived. Chelsea's boyfriend, Nathan, was staying with the family at the farm. Feeling cooped up, Chelsea and Nathan decided it would be a perfect day to go for a walk in the woods. They took the family's two dogs and started walking across that same big field in front of the house, heading towards the same section of forest where Eric and Sean had seen the lights. At first, Chelsea had the dogs on their leashes. But once they got into the woods, she let them off so they could run around and burn off some energy. The two dogs immediately took off, running full speed for about 100 meters into the forest. Then, suddenly, they both came to a dead stop. They were standing right in front of a big mound. From a distance, it just looked like a pile of dirt. But as Chelsea and Nathan got closer, they could see it was something more. It looked like some kind of den. Huge pieces of wood had been leaned against each other to create a sort of lean-to structure. The entire outside of it was covered with moss and dirt and grass, making it blend in with the forest floor. It looked like it had been built very intentionally. On the front of the mound, there was a circular hole, like an entrance. The two dogs had stopped right at this entrance, and they were cautiously poking their heads in and sniffing. Chelsea and Nathan stood there looking at this strange structure. They wondered who could have built it. Was it something a hunter would make, like a blind? Or could an animal have made it? It seemed way too big and complex for any normal animal they could think of, but it was definitely made on purpose. Nathan, being curious, leaned down and tried to peer into the dark hole. He couldn't see anything inside, but he thought he heard a low growling sound coming from deep within the den. That was enough for him. Without a second of hesitation, he stood up and said to Chelsea, "We have to go." "I don't know what's living in there, but we need to get out of here." They quickly put the dogs back on their leashes and hurried out of the forest as fast as they could. When they got back to the house, they told Eric and Shelley what they had found. Sean happened to be there that day too. They described the strange man-made den they had discovered deep in the woods. As soon as they mentioned where they found it straight out from the front porch, Eric and Sean looked at each other. That's when they told Chelsea and Nathan about their own experience a month earlier about the lights and how they could have sworn they heard some large animals stalking them in that exact same area. The pieces of this strange puzzle were starting to come together, and none of them liked the picture it was forming. A couple of months passed. Life on the farm went back to normal, or as normal as it could be. One evening, Eric and Shelley were out on their front porch doing their coffee ritual. It was a cool night, and a low mist was hanging over the entire field, giving the property a slightly creepy vibe. As they were sitting there, they commented to each other about how spooky it looked. But then, their casual conversation took a turn. They both realized at the same time that they couldn't hear any wildlife. There were no crickets chirping, no frogs, no sounds of animals in the woods. Normally, at night, the air was humming with the sounds of nature. But on this night, it was dead silent. Shelley had this high-powered flashlight that she always kept with her on the porch. Feeling uneasy, she picked it up and started scanning the property with the beam. She swept the light across the field, over the barn, and along the tree line. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but the silence was just too odd. After scanning the whole area and seeing nothing, she put the flashlight down and went back to talking with Eric. Eric would later say in interviews that for some reason, the moment she put that flashlight down, a powerful feeling of danger washed over him. He was looking out into the misty darkness, and even though he couldn't see anything, every instinct in his body was screaming that something was wrong. All of a sudden, he turned to Shelley and said, "You know what? We need to go inside." "I don't know what it is, but we need to go inside right now." Shelley was a bit surprised. She said, "Come on, I want to stay out here a little longer. We'll go in a few minutes." But Eric was insistent. He stood up and said, "No, go inside." He tried to grab her arm to gently push her towards the door, but she was still resisting a little. And then, in that moment, Shelley stopped. She froze and whispered, "Did you hear that?" Eric immediately knew that whatever she heard was the reason for his sudden feeling of dread. He turned and looked out into the darkness, but he couldn't see anything. Shelley grabbed her flashlight again and started scanning the tree line. She moved the beam across the field, and when it got about halfway across, right in front of them, she stopped. Because right there in the middle of the field, illuminated by the flashlight's beam, were 3 creatures. They looked like massive wolves. They were just standing there, staring directly at them. And as they watched, 2 more joined them. Now, there were 5 of these huge wolf-like creatures all lined up in the field, all looking right at the porch. Shelley turned to Eric, her voice trembling, and asked, "What are those?" Eric, an experienced hunter who knew all the animals in the Maine woods, had no idea. He said, "I think they're bears. They could be wolves. We have to go inside." Shelley kept the light on them, frozen in fear. And then the creatures started charging. They ran directly at the porch, moving so incredibly fast that Shelley couldn't even keep the beam of light on them. They were already halfway across the field in a matter of seconds. Eric and Shelley scrambled inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Without even speaking a word to each other, they both went on a mission. They moved through the entire bottom floor of the house, locking every single window and closing every blind. They made sure everything was shut and secured. There was something about these 5 creatures that was different. The way they had charged at them, it didn't feel like a random animal encounter. It felt targeted. It felt like they were after them specifically. So even after the house was locked down, they didn't feel safe. They stood in the middle of their living room, and Eric's mind immediately went to his guns. He said, "My guns are in the barn. We have no protection in here." Shelley immediately told him, "Whatever you do, do not go out there. We don't know what those things are. Don't you dare go out there." Shelley then ran upstairs. She went through the second floor, shutting off all the lights and making sure every window was locked tight. Then she went to her daughter Chelsea's room. She woke her up gently and said, "Hey, come here. You have to look at this." They crept over to Chelsea's window. They didn't want to open the blinds all the way because they were terrified the creatures would see them. So they just peeked through a small crack. Shelley whispered, "Look." And there, standing on the gravel path right in front of the house, were the 5 creatures. They were just standing in a perfect row, looking directly at the house. It was like they were waiting. It was like they knew Eric and Shelley were inside and were just patiently waiting for them to come back out. It was not normal animal behavior at all. As Shelley and Chelsea watched, one of the creatures slowly looked up right at the window where they were hiding. And then the creature stood up on its 2 hind legs. Shelley gasped and stumbled backward, falling to the floor. The creature was enormous. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. Shelley was on the ground, looking up at Chelsea, her mind unable to process what she had just seen. How could it have even seen them? They were barely peeking out the window. And how could it stand up on 2 legs like that? And why were they all just sitting in a row outside their house, waiting? What was happening? Shelley pulled herself together and told Chelsea, "Get in your bed. Do not go near your windows. Do not leave this room." And that's when Shelley realized she hadn't heard their 2 dogs bark once during all of this. She started to worry that they might have been left outside. She began walking quietly through the upstairs rooms, calling their names softly. The dogs didn't come. Finally, she went into the master bedroom, and she found them. The 2 dogs were huddled together in the corner of the room, trembling. They looked completely terrified by whatever was outside. Meanwhile, Eric was pacing downstairs. He felt utterly helpless. He needed to get his guns from the barn to protect his family. But he knew it was a huge risk. With his bad back, he couldn't move very fast. He'd have to cross the open yard, unlock the barn, then pull down the heavy gun case and unlock that, all while being completely exposed to those creatures. He decided there had to be another way. He thought maybe he could run outside, get into his truck, and back it right up to the front door. Then he could get Shelley and Chelsea to run out and jump in, and they could just drive away. He went to a window and carefully pulled the blinds aside, just enough to look outside. The 5 creatures were gone. They were no longer standing on the gravel path. He couldn't see them anywhere. He let the blinds fall back into place. He thought, well, I don't know where they are, so it's still too dangerous to go out there. He started pacing again, his mind racing. After a few minutes, he went back to the window and looked again. This time, he saw them. They were back in the field where he and Shelley had first spotted them. All 5 of them were visible because the moon had come out from behind the clouds, illuminating the whole field. They were still facing the house. Eric thought, okay, maybe this is my chance. If I can keep my eye on them, maybe I can open the door, run to the truck, and back it up before they even notice me. So, without telling Shelley what he was about to do, he quietly unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch. He could see them clearly out in the field. They hadn't moved. As quietly as he could, he walked down the porch steps and started making his way across the gravel towards his truck, which was parked about 10 meters away. He kept his eyes locked on the creatures in the field. They still hadn't moved. They apparently hadn't seen him. He reached the driver's side of his truck. He had his keys in his hand and was fumbling to find the unlock button. And then it happened. The motion sensor security light attached to his house kicked on, flooding the entire area with bright light. He was so on edge that the sudden light startled him, and he dropped his keys. The first thing he did was look towards the field. He saw that one of the 5 creatures was now standing on its hind legs, looking directly at him. Before he could even bend down to get his keys, he saw all 5 of them start running towards him at full speed. He dove down, grabbed his keys, and ran for the house as fast as his injured back would allow. He slammed the door shut just as he heard them crossing the gravel right behind him. He heard their heavy bodies bound onto the front porch, and then the sound of them running around the wraparound porch. He was too scared to even look through the window, so he just ducked down to get out of sight. Shelley, who was upstairs, heard all the commotion and yelled down, "Eric, what's going on?" He just yelled back, "Stay up there! Stay up there!" The entire family was frozen. Eric, Shelley, and Chelsea were all just listening, knowing that those creatures were right on the other side of the wall, walking along their porch. After what felt like an eternity, he heard their footsteps leave the porch and go back onto the gravel. At some point, he finally got the courage to peek his head up and look out the window. All 5 of them were sitting there, again, right in front of the house, just facing it, as if they were waiting. Eric scurried up the stairs to where Shelley and Chelsea were. They were all terrified. They decided they had no choice but to call the police. They figured, if nothing else, a police car driving up with its lights on might be enough to scare the creatures away. Shelley made the call. On the phone, she tried to explain that they were scared of something on their property. She said there were 5 creatures, things, running around outside their house. The police officer on the other end of the line was immediately skeptical. He asked, "All right, ma'am, are you sure it's not a moose? Are you sure it's not a bear?" Shelley insisted it wasn't. She pleaded, "Can you please just come over here?" But the officer just said, "Listen, ma'am, just keep your doors and windows shut. I'm sure it'll be fine." And that's how the call ended. They were completely on their own. The family felt helpless. Eric, in particular, was frustrated and angry. He couldn't protect his family. He couldn't get to his weapons. He couldn't get to his truck. They were trapped. They decided the only thing they could do was barricade themselves inside the house. For the next 30 minutes, they worked together, pushing heavy furniture in front of all the doors and windows on the ground floor. They blocked everything as best they could. They went to the kitchen and gathered knives, and they found an axe they used for chopping firewood. With their makeshift weapons, they went upstairs and locked themselves in the master bedroom with their 2 dogs. They all got on the bed together. They decided all they could do now was wait for the sun to come up. During the time they were barricading the house, they had looked out the window from time to time. And each time, they saw the 5 creatures just sitting on the gravel area, waiting for them. But as soon as they finally went upstairs and locked themselves in the bedroom, they heard the creatures move. They heard at least a couple of them walk back onto the porch, and then it was totally silent except for the sounds of these creatures. It was clear they were communicating with each other. They would make strange howling and bumping sounds. It sounded like they were trying to coordinate some kind of attack on the house. The way the farmhouse was built, the second floor was a bit smaller than the first floor. This meant the first floor had its own separate roof that you could walk on right below the second floor windows. After a while, the creatures stopped walking on the porch. They heard silence, and then they heard a loud thud. They had jumped onto that first floor roof. The scary thing about this was that from that roof, you could walk right up to the second floor windows and look inside. So the family was lying there in the dark, listening. Periodically, they would hear them walking on the roof right outside their bedroom. There were windows on either side of the room they were in, with only thin curtains covering them. From time to time, one of the creatures would walk past their window and stop. They would hear it put its paws up on the window glass, and they could see its dark silhouette through the thin curtain. It was looking inside. All night long, they listened to these creatures running around on their roof. Sometimes they would hear a loud, violent scratching sound, as if they had found a weak spot and were trying to claw their way into the house. But after a whole night of this, they never actually broke through the glass. They never got inside. As the first light of dawn started to break on the horizon, the creatures jumped off the roof. The family could hear them running away back towards the forest. For about an hour, they sat in the room listening. They didn't hear anything else. The sun was up now, and they finally felt like it might be safe. They unlocked the bedroom door, went downstairs, and carefully moved the furniture away from the front door. They opened it up and stepped outside. All over their property, there was evidence of what had happened. There were massive footprints in the soft dirt, footprints with huge claw marks at the end of them. They found tufts of dark hair that had gotten caught on fence posts. And even scarier, they found all these spots on the house where the creatures had clearly tried to get in. The siding on the second floor, right by the windows, was shredded with deep scratch marks. The front door had been scratched to pieces. It was undeniable that whatever these creatures were, they had been trying very hard to get inside the house. But for some reason, they had been unsuccessful. This experience was so traumatic for the Martin family that they couldn't stay there. They put the house up for sale and they moved away as quickly as they could. They have never experienced anything like that since they left that isolated farmhouse in Palmyra. So what do you think those creatures were? Were they bears or wolves, or were they something else entirely? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. This story is about a grandfather named Chris Watson who lived a comfortable life. Chris spent decades building his career, starting out in social work, helping the homeless, before transitioning into the lucrative travel and tourism industry. He divided his time between his quiet hometown and Saigon, Vietnam, where he had established a successful network of travel companies. Chris was a man of routines, but he also had a taste for the finer things. He drove a beautiful high-end Ford Raptor truck, and he was almost always carrying his signature Louis Vuitton bag. To his family, Chris was a doting grandfather who wanted to ensure his children and grandchildren were set up for the future. Through smart investments, Chris had managed to amass a fortune of around $3 million. He felt like he could finally sit back and enjoy his retirement. But unfortunately, his success also drew the attention of someone with a dark, greedy plan. It all began on what was supposed to be a peaceful vacation. Chris had been working hard and felt like he needed a break. Before leaving, he made sure to get a routine checkup at his dentist's office, and he had even taken care of his health by getting vaccinated with Gardasil, as he wanted to ensure he was in peak physical shape. He was an active, older man who loved outdoor activities, especially cycling with local clubs. As he boarded his flight and began his holiday, Chris decided to completely unplug. He turned down his screen brightness, put his phone on silent, and prepared to enjoy some quiet time away from work. But shortly after arriving at his vacation spot, his dream holiday quickly turned into a living nightmare. It started very subtly. Chris was relaxing in his rental home when he began to feel a slight discomfort in his stomach. At first, he brushed it off as a simple case of food poisoning or jet lag from his travels. He decided to drink some water and try to sleep it off. But as the hours went by, his condition grew dramatically worse. He was hit with violent waves of nausea and started vomiting uncontrollably. Along with the stomach pain, a blinding, crushing headache began to set in. But the most terrifying symptom was the sudden failure of his vision. Chris realized he could barely see. The room was spinning and everything looked incredibly dark and blurry, even when he turned the lights up. His family, realizing this was far more serious than a simple stomach bug, rushed him to the nearest hospital. When Chris arrived at the emergency room, the medical staff was completely baffled. His organs were rapidly shutting down, and his blood chemistry was severely abnormal. The doctors tried everything they could to stabilize him. Because Chris had recently visited his dentist and taken some routine medications, the doctors initially wondered if he was experiencing an extremely rare, delayed allergic reaction to an anesthetic. They ran standard toxicology screens and treated him for severe metabolic distress, but nothing they did seemed to work. Within a matter of hours, Chris Watson passed away. The sudden, agonizing death of this vibrant, healthy grandfather left his family in an absolute state of shock and grief. They could not understand how a man who had been in such great shape just days before could suddenly deteriorate and die so quickly. In the immediate aftermath, the local authorities and medical staff believed that Chris's death was the result of a tragic accident or a natural medical emergency. The initial theory was that he had suffered a stroke or accidental food poisoning. It seemed like a tragic, heartbreaking end to a wonderful life, and the police were prepared to close the case as a death by natural causes. But then, a massive financial red flag went up that changed the entire direction of the case. Only a few days after Chris passed away, a claim was filed to access his estate and his $3 million life insurance policy. The family expected that Chris's hard-earned wealth would be distributed to his children and grandchildren, but they were stunned to find that the primary beneficiary on his accounts had been changed very recently, right before his death. The person claiming the $3 million was not his children or his grandchildren. It was a woman whom the family had barely even heard of. She claimed to be a close associate of Chris, but her sudden appearance and her immediate attempt to claim his entire fortune made the family incredibly suspicious. They immediately went to the police and demanded a full investigation. The detectives assigned to the case realized that something was seriously wrong. They began by reconstructing Chris's final days, trying to figure out exactly who he had been spending time with before he fell ill. They obtained security camera footage from several locations that Chris had visited during his vacation. As they reviewed the footage, they found something incredibly suspicious. They looked at cameras from a popular high-end shopping district called Marina Square, where Chris had spent an afternoon. In the footage, Chris could be seen walking through the open-air mall carrying his luxury Louis Vuitton bag. But he was not alone. Walking just a few paces behind him was a woman wearing a very distinctive, bright purple dress. Later in the footage, the detectives saw Chris and the woman in the purple dress sitting together at an outdoor cafe. They were engaged in a friendly conversation. At one point, the woman stood up, walked over to the counter, and ordered 2 drinks. She returned to the table and handed Chris a cup of matcha tea. The cameras captured Chris taking several large sips of the drink while the woman watched him intently. It turns out this suspect had a very cunning way of gathering information. She had visited the very same dentist's office where Chris was a patient. By pretending to be a family member or simply by exploiting a moment of distraction when the receptionist stepped away from the front desk, she managed to catch a glimpse of Chris's patient file. This file contained sensitive personal information, including his full name, date of birth, home address, and financial details. This was the key she needed to begin her fraudulent scheme. She was a woman who was drowning in debt, living far beyond her means, and she desperately wanted to maintain a high society lifestyle without actually working for it. With this new lead, the detectives knew they had to halt any plans for Chris's burial and order a comprehensive forensic autopsy, specifically requesting an advanced toxicological analysis. When the lab results finally came back, they completely shattered the initial theory of an accidental death. The medical examiner discovered that Chris's body contained highly lethal levels of methanol mixed with a stabilizing compound known as methyl cellulose. Methanol is an incredibly dangerous chemical. It is a highly toxic form of alcohol that is commonly found in industrial solvents, windshield wiper fluid, and even high-end nail polishes, which are sometimes imported as German polish. It is a silent and deadly poison because when it is ingested, the body metabolizes it into formaldehyde and then into formic acid. This acid directly attacks the optic nerves, which explains why Chris experienced such sudden and terrifying vision loss before his vital organs shut down. The presence of methyl cellulose was also a critical detail, as it is a chemical thickener. The killer had likely used it to keep the methanol suspended in the drink and to alter the texture, making it harder for Chris to notice that his matcha tea had been laced with a deadly chemical. The detectives now knew they were dealing with a premeditated murder. They went back to the rental home and searched the trash bins, eventually finding the discarded paper cup from the matcha tea that Chris had been drinking on the day he fell ill. The forensic laboratory tested the residue inside the cup, and the results confirmed their suspicions. The cup was heavily contaminated with traces of methanol and methyl cellulose. The focus of the investigation shifted entirely to the mysterious woman in the purple dress. The police identified her and obtained a search warrant for her home and all of her personal electronic devices, including her Apple computer. The digital forensics team took her Apple computer and began a deep dive into the hard disk. What they found on that hard drive was absolutely devastating. The suspect had not been careful. Her search history was filled with incredibly incriminating queries. Over the weeks leading up to Chris's death, she had searched for phrases like how to buy pure methanol online, what is the lethal dose of methanol for an older man, how long does it take for methanol to kill someone, and can an autopsy detect methyl cellulose? She had also spent hours researching how to make a chemical poisoning look like a natural heart attack or stroke. The digital forensics unit had to use advanced data recovery software to search the hard disk of her Apple computer. The suspect thought she was clever because she had deleted her search history and emptied her trash bin before the police arrived. But she did not realize that when you delete a file on a computer, the data remains on the hard drive until it is overwritten by new information. The forensic experts were able to recover every single deleted file, including her web searches, her online purchase receipts for the industrial methanol, and the drafts of the forged beneficiary forms. They even found a digital log showing the exact dates and times she had accessed Chris's financial accounts to change his beneficiary information. With all of this evidence, the detectives were able to reconstruct exactly how this horrific crime had taken place. The woman in the purple dress had met Chris through his travel business and immediately saw him as an opportunity to secure a life of luxury. She spent months befriending him, gaining his trust, and learning his daily routines. She found out about his $3 million net worth and decided that she wanted it all for herself. She carefully planned the murder, purchasing the industrial methanol and methyl cellulose online. She knew that Chris loved matcha tea, which has a very strong earthy flavor and a naturally thick texture. She realized that this would be the perfect vehicle for the poison, as the strong taste of the matcha would easily mask the harsh chemical burn of the methanol, and the natural thickness would disguise the addition of the methyl cellulose. On the day of the murder, she wore her eye-catching purple dress and met Chris at Marina Square. She acted like a caring friend, buying him his favorite matcha tea and secretly slipping the pre-measured lethal dose of poison into his cup. She watched him drink it, knowing that she had just signed his death warrant. She then escorted him back to his rental, where she left him to die a slow, agonizing death. She believed that because methanol poisoning mimics the symptoms of other medical emergencies, the doctors would write it off as a natural death, especially given Chris's age. She figured the body would be quickly cremated or buried, and she would be free to claim the $3 million and live a life of luxury, perhaps buying her own high-end vehicles like a Ford Raptor or traveling the world. But her greed and overconfidence led to her downfall. She did not realize that the security cameras at Marina Square had captured her every move, and she did not expect the detectives to thoroughly analyze her Apple computer's hard disk. During the highly publicized trial, the prosecutors presented the security camera footage from Marina Square and the deleted digital evidence recovered from the hard disk of her Apple computer. The defense team tried to claim that Chris had accidentally consumed the methanol from a household product like German polish, but the exact chemical trace found in his body matched the precise recipe on the suspect's hard drive. The jury quickly found her guilty of first-degree murder, financial fraud, and forgery, and the judge sentenced her to life in prison without parole. While justice was eventually served, the emotional pain remained for Chris's grieving family. The $3 million estate was returned to his heirs, but his empty Ford Raptor truck and his signature Louis Vuitton bag sat as silent reminders of a vibrant life cut tragically short by sheer greed. They are left with the haunting lesson that sometimes the most dangerous people stand closest to us, wearing a friendly smile and offering a warm drink. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Millions of people go into the deep woods every single year. They go to find peace. They go to escape the loud noises of the city. They want to connect with nature and clear their minds. Most of the time, these people have amazing trips. They hike the trails. They sit by the campfire. They look up at the stars, and then they go home to their families with great memories. But sometimes people go into these massive forests and they simply vanish. They disappear under conditions that make absolutely no sense at all. In some cases, people are walking right next to their friends or family. They turn around for just a second. When they turn back, their companion is gone. There is no sound. There is no struggle. There is just empty space. In other cases, people go missing, and then they are found days later in places that are completely impossible to reach. They are found on top of high cliffs or deep inside thick briar patches where there are no paths. For a long time, no one was looking at these cases as a whole. People just assumed they were isolated incidents. They thought people simply got lost, or fell, or got attacked by wild animals. But one man changed that. His name is David Paulides. He is a former police detective. He spent years investigating crimes and looking at evidence. One day, he started noticing that there were thousands of these bizarre disappearances happening in national parks and forests all over North America. He realized that nobody was keeping a central database of these missing people. The government was not tracking them. The Park Service was not keeping a master list. So, David decided to look into it himself. He started gathering police reports, search and rescue logs, and talking to the families of the victims. He began putting all of his findings into a fascinating series of books called Missing 411. These books outline very specific patterns that show up in these disappearances over and over again. Today, we are going to look at 3 of these cases. These are stories about people who went camping in the beautiful wilderness, and then things went horribly wrong. Let us start in 1985. Kevin O'Keefe was a 36-year-old man who lived in Sacramento, California. Kevin was the kind of guy who lived for the outdoors. He was not a casual hiker who just walked on paved paths on the weekends. He was an outdoor enthusiast. He loved the challenge of testing himself against nature. He loved going on long hikes, pitching his tent in the wilderness, and sleeping under the stars. For years, Kevin had one dream that stood above all the rest. He wanted to go camping in Alaska. To him, Alaska was the ultimate frontier. It was the wild, rugged land that every serious camper wanted to conquer. By the summer of 1985, Kevin decided that he was finally going to make this dream a reality. He started doing massive amounts of research. He looked at maps of Alaska. He read books about the different terrains. He studied the weather patterns. He wanted to find a place that was truly wild. Eventually, he settled on an area called Glacier Bay National Park. Even by Alaskan standards, Glacier Bay is incredibly rugged. It is a place of massive glaciers, cold, deep water, dense forests, and tall mountains. It is a place where you are completely on your own. There are no cell phone towers. There are no roads. If you get into trouble, help is not coming quickly. Kevin knew this. He was a smart guy. He was not foolish. He knew that going into the Alaskan wilderness by himself was a huge risk. So, to prepare, he did not just buy gear. He actually enrolled in a specialized class. This class was designed to teach people how to survive in the wild Alaskan environment. He learned how to handle extreme weather. He learned how to keep his food safe from brown bears. He learned how to navigate without a compass if he had to. He spent weeks studying and practicing. He wanted to make sure he was ready for absolutely anything. On the 20th of September, 1985, Kevin finally boarded a plane in Sacramento. He flew to Juneau, Alaska. When he landed, he felt the cold northern air. He was incredibly excited. From Juneau, he had to take a boat and hike his way up to Glacier Bay National Park. When he arrived at the park, the first thing he did was walk into the park headquarters. He wanted to register his trip. This is what responsible campers do. He walked up to the park rangers who were working at the desk. He introduced himself. He told them that he was going to be camping over near the Wolf Point area. Wolf Point is a very isolated spot. It is located right against the cold water of the bay. Kevin told the rangers that he planned to be out there for about 3 weeks. He said he would be leaving the park on October 10. The rangers wrote all of this down. They were glad he checked in. They knew that there was now a 36-year-old man from California staying by himself near Wolf Point. They knew his exact timeline. For the next couple of weeks, no one heard from Kevin. His family, back in California, did not get any phone calls or letters. The park rangers did not see him. But this was exactly how Kevin wanted it. The whole point of his trip was to escape reality. He wanted to live in nature. He wanted to disconnect from the modern world and just be alone with his thoughts. So, because he was not supposed to contact anyone until October 10, no one was worried. No one raised any red flags. The days went by, and the wilderness remained quiet. But then, we get to October 8. This was 2 days before Kevin was scheduled to pack up his gear and leave the park. On this day, a couple of park rangers were out on a routine patrol. They were in a small motorized boat navigating the waterways around Wolf Point. They knew that Kevin's campsite was nearby. They knew he had been out there by himself for almost 3 weeks. Because they were close by, the rangers decided to take a little detour. They wanted to pull their boat into the bay at Wolf Point and just check in on him. They wanted to make sure he was doing okay and see if he needed anything before his scheduled departure in 2 days. They steered their boat toward the shore. They turned the last corner where they could finally see the area where Kevin was supposed to be camping. And as soon as they looked at the shoreline, they froze. They knew immediately that something was wrong. The first thing they noticed was Kevin's tent. It was not where it was supposed to be. There was a flat, grassy area of soil slightly inland where campers always set up their tents. It was the safest and most level spot. But Kevin's tent was not there. Instead, the tent was sitting down on the gravel beach. It was right next to the water where the tide could easily reach it. This made no sense. An experienced camper would never pitch a tent on a wet beach right by the freezing ocean water. As they got closer, they noticed something even more disturbing. Some of Kevin's gear was lying outside of the tent. It was not scattered around like a tornado had hit it. It was placed outside. It looked like someone had deliberately set it on the ground. And then they looked at the tent itself. The top strut, which is the fiberglass pole that holds the top of the tent upright and keeps the fabric tight, was completely folded down. It looked like it had snapped right in the middle. The tent was partially collapsed. The rangers stopped their boat. They got out and walked onto the gravel. The air was cold and silent. They called out Kevin's name. They yelled into the trees. No one answered. The only sound was the wind and the water hitting the shore. The rangers stood there and tried to think logically. They thought, okay, maybe Kevin is getting ready to leave in 2 days. Maybe he is packing up his camp. Maybe he decided to go on one last day hike to see the sights before he departs. They figured that the broken tent pole might have happened during a strong windstorm and he just had not fixed it yet. They told themselves that everything was probably fine. They did not want to panic. So they decided to get back in their boat and leave. But they made a plan to come back the very next day to double check on him. The next morning, October 9, the Rangers returned to Wolf Point. They pulled their boat up to the beach. They looked at the campsite. There had been absolutely no change. The tent was still sitting on the beach in the exact same spot. The broken top strut was still collapsed. The gear was still sitting outside on the sand. The sleeping bag and the sleeping pad were untouched. It was incredibly clear that Kevin had not returned to his campsite since the Rangers were there 24 hours earlier. At this point, the Rangers became deeply concerned. They knew they could not wait any longer. They needed to find Kevin. They immediately contacted their headquarters and launched an official search. The search effort was massive. The Park Service brought in small airplanes to fly low over the Wolf Point area and the surrounding forests. They hoped to spot Kevin's bright clothing or perhaps a smoke signal from a campfire. But they saw nothing. Just green trees and cold gray water. Then they brought in ground searchers. These searchers walked shoulder to shoulder through the thick brush. They brought in highly trained search dogs. These dogs were experts at picking up human scent and tracking it through the wilderness. The searchers went to Kevin's campsite first to see what they could find. What they discovered at the campsite made the situation even more baffling. When they searched the collapsed tent and the immediate area, they found virtually all of the equipment you would expect to find at a campsite. In fact, he had everything he needed to survive. His backpack was leaning against a tree. It was fully packed. Inside the backpack, they found his food, his extra warm clothes, and his water container. It was packed as if he was just about to go on a hike. His sleeping bag, his sleeping pad, and his cooking equipment were all right there. But the most bizarre thing was the food. Kevin had a lot of food left. Some of it was sitting out in the open, completely exposed to the elements. In Alaska, this is unheard of. The forests are filled with hungry animals. There are brown bears, black bears, wolves, wolverines, and foxes. If you leave food out in the open in Alaska, animals will find it. They will tear your camp apart to get to it. But none of the food at Kevin's campsite had been touched. Not a single animal had nibbled on it. It was completely pristine. This was a massive anomaly. It was as if the local wildlife was actively staying away from the campsite. The searchers kept pushed outward. They sent the dogs into the thick brush surrounding the camp. They searched for hours. And then the dogs started alerting. They ran toward a deep gully that was located about half a mile away from the campsite. This gully was incredibly steep and filled with thick vegetation. You could not see into it from the trail. It was completely hidden from the naked eye. The dogs scrambled down into the gully, and the searchers followed them. At the bottom of the gully, the dogs found something. It was Kevin's boots. They also found his glove liner and his hat. They were tucked away, almost as if they had been placed there deliberately. When the searchers found these items, the initial theory was that Kevin must have been attacked by a bear. It seemed like the only logical explanation. He was in the deep Alaskan wilderness, and now his clothes and boots were found half a mile away in a gully. But the park rangers who were leading the search disagreed. They had lived and worked in Alaska for decades. They had seen bear attacks before. They knew what a bear attack looked like. They said this was definitely not a bear attack. When a human is attacked by a large predator like a grizzly bear, there is a massive struggle. The human fights for their life. They grab onto branches. They kick up the dirt. They flail around. There are broken bushes, torn clothes, and most importantly, there is blood. But at Kevin's campsite, there was absolutely no sign of a struggle. There was not a single drop of blood. There were no human remains. There was nothing to indicate that anyone had been hurt in that space. And then there was the question of the food. If a bear had come into the camp and attacked Kevin, the bear would have smelled the food. Bears are driven by their sense of smell. They would have eaten every scrap of food in that camp. But the food was untouched. The rangers kept coming back to how quiet the camp was. There was no animal activity at all. No birds, no rodents, nothing. It was like a dead zone. With no clues left at the camp, investigators went to speak with Kevin's family in Sacramento. They asked them if Kevin had been depressed. They asked if there was any chance he had gone out into the woods to end his own life. The family was shocked. They said, absolutely not. They said Kevin was incredibly happy. He was well adjusted. He was so excited about this trip. He had spent months preparing for it. He had even taken that survival class. They told the investigators that Kevin had planned on taking a few short day hikes, but he had no plans to do any overnight trips away from his main camp. He also had no plans to meet up with anyone else. He wanted to be completely alone. After just a few days of searching, the weather in Alaska began to turn. The temperatures dropped and the snow began to fall. With absolutely no leads, no tracks, and no signs of where Kevin could have gone, the authorities had to make a difficult decision. They called off the search. Kevin O'Keefe was officially gone. Now, let us look at the facts. We know that all of Kevin's gear was still at his campsite. His backpack was packed. This means he did not leave his camp voluntarily to go on one of those day hikes he told his family about. No experienced hiker, especially one who took a survival course, would ever walk into the Alaskan wilderness without their pack, their food, and their extra clothes. Doing that is an absolute death sentence. You would freeze or starve in a matter of days. So, Kevin must have been at his campsite when something happened to him. But we know it was not an animal attack because there was no blood, no struggle, and the food was not touched. So, if it was not an animal, what was it? What could have caused his tent to be moved down to the beach? What broke the top strut of his tent? What caused him to leave his gear behind, and why were his boots, his glove liner, and his hat hidden in a steep gully half a mile away? And most importantly, where was Kevin? To this day, no one has ever found him. He vanished into the wild, leaving behind nothing but questions. Now, let us fast forward to the year 2000. We are going to move south, down to the state of Montana. Patrick Whalen was 33 years old. Pat was not just an outdoor enthusiast. He was someone who bordered on being a full-blown survivalist. This was a man who possessed incredible outdoor skills. He did not just go camping for weekends. He lived in the wild. He had hiked thousands of miles across the Pacific Crest Trail, which is one of the longest and most difficult hiking trails in the entire world. He had spent hundreds of hours camping in deep, isolated forests, but out of all the places he had ever visited, there was one place that he loved more than anywhere else. That was Glacier National Park in Montana. Glacier National Park is famous for its stunning beauty. It has massive peaks, deep valleys, and thick pine forests. But it is also incredibly wild and dangerous. Pat loved it. He spent so much time in Glacier National Park that he became a regular face. The park rangers who worked there got to know him. They recognized his face. They knew him by name. They knew he was an expert who could survive in almost any condition. They never worried about him when he went into the park because they knew he had the skills to handle anything. On the 2nd of November 2000, Pat was driving his truck in an area called Kiowa Junction, which is just outside the park in Montana. As he was driving down the road, a deer suddenly jumped out in front of his truck. Pat could not stop in time. He hit the deer. Now, what happened next is one of the strangest parts of this entire story. There were witnesses who saw the accident. They watched Pat stop his truck and get out. He walked over to the injured deer lying on the side of the road, but he did not call for help. He did not try to put the animal out of its misery. Instead, he walked back to his truck. He grabbed a pillow from the cab. He walked back to the deer and gently placed the pillow under the deer's head. Then he went back to his truck again. He grabbed some food, walked back to the deer, and placed the food right next to its mouth. And then, without saying a word to anyone, Pat just walked away. He abandoned his truck right there on the side of the road. It is not clear if the truck was damaged so badly that it could not run, or if Pat just decided he was done with it. But either way, he left it. The next day, local authorities found the abandoned truck and had it towed to a local tow lot. Nobody knew where Pat had gone. He had simply walked off into the landscape. 6 months went by. During this time, Pat's family had not heard a single word from him. This was not entirely unusual for Pat, as he liked to go off the grid for long periods of time. But 6 months was a very long time, even for him. His father began to get deeply worried. He decided to call the park rangers at Glacier National Park. He knew how much Pat loved that park. He told the rangers that he had not heard from his son in months. He said he was terrified that something had happened to him. He asked them if they had seen Pat in the park. The rangers, who remembered Pat well, told his father that they had not seen him recently. But they promised they would keep an eye out for him during their patrols. A couple of weeks after that phone call, 2 park rangers were out on a routine patrol in a remote, heavily wooded section of Glacier National Park. As they were walking through the dense trees, they stumbled upon a very odd scene. They saw a blue tent set up in the middle of a clearing. There was no campfire burning. There was no sound of anyone around. As they got closer, they noticed that the middle strut, the main pole that held the tent up, was collapsed. The tent was sagging badly. The rangers stopped. They yelled out to see if anyone was inside. They wanted to make sure whoever was in there was okay. But no one answered. The forest was completely silent. They walked up to the tent. They could see that the fabric of the tent was extremely weathered. It was faded and sun-bleached. This meant the tent had been sitting out in the elements for a very long time. But despite being sun-bleached, there were no tears in the fabric. There were no holes. And most interestingly, all of the zippers on the tent were completely shut. The rangers reached down and unzipped the tent. They peered inside. There was no one there. But the tent was not empty. Inside, they found all of the items you would expect to find at a survivalist campsite. There was water, plenty of food, a camping stove, extra clothes, and his boots. Everything was neatly placed inside. But Pat was gone. And just like in the case of Kevin O'Keefe, the rangers noticed something highly unusual. There was food inside this tent. The tent had been sitting unoccupied in the middle of a wild national park for months. Glacier National Park is prime grizzly bear territory. Bears have an incredible sense of smell. They can smell food from miles away. They will easily rip through tent fabric to get to a single energy bar. But this tent had no tears. No animals had tried to get inside. The food was completely untouched. The rangers immediately filed a report and a search was launched. Authorities brought out search teams and cadaver dogs. They combed the woods around the blue tent. They looked under logs and in ravines. But they found nothing. The dogs could not pick up any scent at all. One of the biggest challenges the searchers faced was that they had no idea when Pat had actually arrived at the spot or when he had disappeared. They went to the tow yard where his truck had been taken 6 months earlier after the deer accident. The truck was still sitting there. Pat had never come to claim it. This meant he had likely walked straight into the park 6 months ago and had been missing ever since. But as the investigators searched the inside of the blue tent more closely, they found one detail that was incredibly chilling. They found an empty leather case for a buck knife. The sheath was there, but the knife was gone. David Paulides looked at this detail and offered a very interesting theory. Pat was an expert survivalist. He knew how to handle himself in the woods. He was sleeping in his tent one night. Suddenly, he heard something outside. It was not a normal sound. It was something formidable. It was something that made a seasoned, brave survivalist feel the need to arm himself. Pat reached down, pulled his heavy buck knife out of its sheath, and prepared to go outside. The mosquitoes in that area of Montana are notoriously bad, especially at night. So, even though Pat was in a hurry, he stepped out of the tent and took a second to zip the tent completely shut behind him. He did this to keep the bugs from getting inside his sleeping area. He stood outside in the dark, holding his knife, ready to confront whatever was making that noise. And then, he never went back inside. Whatever was out there in the dark apparently got the best of Pat. But we cannot simply say he was attacked by a wild animal. If a bear or a mountain lion had attacked him right outside his tent, there would have been a massive struggle. There would have been blood on the ground. There would have been torn clothing or broken branches. But the campsite was clean. There was no blood. There were no remains. And again, if a hungry predator had killed Pat, it would have smelled the food inside the tent and ripped it open. But the tent was left untouched. So what did Pat hear? Why did he grab his knife and step out into the night? What did he confront, and where did he go? To this day, Patrick Whalen has never been found. His empty blue tent and his empty knife sheath are the only clues he left behind. Now, let us move to our third story. This takes us to April of 1976 in the state of New York. Stephen Thomas was 19 years old. Steve was a young man who was full of life. He was athletic, adventurous, and he absolutely loved hiking. He had spent a lot of time hiking in the rugged mountains of Washington state, so he was very experienced. He knew how to handle steep trails and rough weather. In April of 1976, Steve was living in New York. His good friend Bruce Weber contacted him. Bruce said that he and 4 of his friends were planning to go on a hike up Mount Marcy. Mount Marcy is the highest peak in the state of New York. It is a massive, beautiful mountain, but it is also very dangerous. The weather near the summit can change in an instant. It can go from sunny to freezing cold and windy in a matter of minutes. Steve did not know the other 4 guys who were going on the trip. But he trusted Bruce and he loved hiking, so he eagerly agreed to join them. On the morning of the hike, Steve was packing his gear at his home. His mother was watching him. She had a very strange, uneasy feeling in her chest. She looked at her son and told him that she had a really bad feeling about this trip. She told him that maybe he should just cancel. She did not like the idea of him going up such a rugged mountain with people he did not know very well. She begged him to stay home. But Steve just smiled. He was 19, he was confident, and he had a lot of hiking experience. He told his mother that she was worrying too much. He said everything would be completely fine and that he would see her in a couple of days. He gave her a hug, grabbed his gear, and left. On the 12th of April, 1976, the 6 young men began their trek up Mount Marcy. The hike was long and exhausting. The trail was steep and they had to carry heavy packs. By about 3:30 inches the afternoon, they had made their way near the summit of the mountain. They were very close to the top, but they were all completely exhausted. The wind was picking up and the temperature was starting to drop. The group decided that instead of pushing all the way to the summit today, they would make camp right where they were. They would pitch their tents, rest for the night, and then attack the summit the next morning when they were fresh. Everyone was relieved to stop and rest, except for Steve. Steve was restless. He had a lot of energy, and he did not want to sit around. The group set up their tents, and Steve went into Bruce's tent. He sat down and started studying the map of Mount Marcy. He looked at the trail leading up to the summit. He looked at Bruce and asked if he wanted to go for a quick walk up the path with him. He said he just wanted to stretch his legs and see what the trail looked like. But Bruce was exhausted. He told Steve no. He said he was too tired and that they should just wait and go up together tomorrow morning. Steve did not want to wait. He boiled some water and made himself some tea. He sat there for a bit, drinking his tea and looking at the map. But he just could not sit still. Finally, he folded the map up. He looked at Bruce and said that he was just going to walk up the path a little way by himself. He promised he would be right back. Bruce immediately told him that this was a bad idea. He told him not to go up there alone. The sun was starting to go down. The temperatures were dropping fast. The wind was getting stronger. It was a recipe for disaster. The other hikers, who did not know Steve very well, also chimed in. They told him he should just stay in the camp and rest. But Steve was stubborn. He shrugged his shoulders and said he would only be gone for a few minutes. Because Steve thought he was only going to be gone for a short walk, he did not pack any gear. He left his backpack in the tent. This backpack contained his food, his water, his map, his matches, and his extra warm clothing. He was wearing just a t-shirt and pants. Before he walked out of the tent, he grabbed a bright yellow rain jacket and threw it on over his t-shirt. That was it. He had no supplies. He had no way to make fire. He had no water. He just walked out of the tent and headed up the trail. At the time Steve left, the ground was covered in hard-packed snow. The snow was frozen solid, which actually made it very easy to walk on. You did not sink into it. And because it was a clear night, there was a bright full moon shining down on the mountain. The moonlight reflected off the white snow, making everything incredibly bright. You could see for a long distance without even using a flashlight. As Steve walked away from the camp, the other hikers were annoyed with him for being stubborn, but they were not really worried. They knew Steve was an experienced hiker. He had hiked in much tougher conditions in Washington. The trail was clear, the snow was hard, and the moon was bright. They figured he would walk up the trail for 10 or 15 minutes, get cold, and then turn around and come back to the warm tent. It seemed like a minor thing. But then, an hour went by. By this point, the sun had completely set. It was night. The temperature on the mountain had plummeted to well below freezing. The wind was howling through the trees. Steve had been gone for an hour, and he was only wearing a t-shirt and a light yellow rain jacket. He was not dressed to survive sub-freezing temperatures for long. The hikers realized that something was wrong. They walked a short distance up the trail and started yelling Steve's name into the wind. They listened, but they heard nothing. Only the sound of the wind. They realized they had to go look for him. The conditions were getting deadly, and if Steve was hurt or lost, he would freeze to death very quickly. The hikers turned back to their tents to grab their heavy winter gear and flashlights so they could go make a search trek up the mountain. Now, one of the 4 hikers that Steve did not know very well had brought his dog along on this trip. This dog was highly energetic. It was the kind of dog that loved being outdoors. It loved hiking. Anytime the dog had the chance to run around in the woods, it would do it in a heartbeat. It was never tired, and it was never scared. But when the owner went into his tent to get his gear, he went to grab his dog's leash to bring the dog with them to search for Steve. He figured the dog's sharp senses would help them find him in the dark. But the dog refused to leave the tent. The owner pulled on the leash, but the dog would not budge. Instead, the dog cowered in the very back of the tent. It was shaking. It was whimpering and acting like it was absolutely terrified of something that was right outside of the tent. The owner was stunned. He had never, in all his years, seen his dog act this way. The dog was so terrified that it refused to step 1 foot outside into the night. It would rather stay alone in a dark, cold tent on a mountain than go outside with its owner. The hikers did not have time to figure out what was wrong with the dog. They had to find Steve. They left the terrified dog in the tent and went out into the freezing night. They hiked up the trail, shining their flashlights and calling out. But the wind was too strong and the cold was biting. After searching for a while, it became too dangerous for them to continue. They were starting to get hypothermia themselves. They had to make the painful decision to turn back to their camp. They crawled into their sleeping bags, listening to the wind, and prayed that Steve had somehow found shelter on the mountain. As soon as the sun rose the next morning, the hikers were out of their tent. They started searching again, yelling Steve's name. But there was no sign of him. The snow was still hard-packed, but there were no fresh footprints. After a few hours of searching, with no luck, the group had to make a decision. 3 of them decided to stay at the camp in case Steve returned. The other 3, including Bruce, began the grueling 4-hour hike down the mountain to get to a vehicle so they could drive to the nearest town and alert the authorities. Once the authorities were notified, they did not hesitate. They launched one of the largest and most intensive search and rescue operations in the history of the state of New York. Over the next 2 weeks, the mountain was crawling with searchers. They brought in helicopters to fly over the peaks. They brought in professional search dog teams. They had hundreds of ground searchers combing every single foot of the mountain. They were looking for any sign of Steve. They thought that because he was wearing a bright, high-visibility yellow rain jacket, he would be incredibly easy to spot against the white snow or the green trees. But they found absolutely nothing. It was like Steve had dissolved into the air. After 2 weeks of intense searching, the official rescue effort was called off. The authorities believed that Steve had succumbed to the elements and that his body was lost somewhere in a deep crevice. But Steve's family refused to give up. In particular, his older brother, Bob. Bob was 26 years old. He was in incredible physical shape, and he was extremely close with his younger brother, Steve. When the official search ended, Bob made a life-altering decision. He quit his job. He packed up his life and moved to the Mount Marcy area. He dedicated his entire life to finding his brother. For a whole year, Bob searched Mount Marcy. He did not just walk the main trails. He went deep into the trackless wilderness. He climbed steep cliffs. He crawled through thick brush. He searched caves and ravines. The veteran park rangers who worked on Mount Marcy began to joke that Bob knew the mountain better than they did. Over that year, Bob walked over 2,500 miles on the mountain. He reached the summit of Mount Marcy over 600 times. Every single time he went up, he took a different route. He looked under every boulder. He peered into every bush. He was looking for any scrap of yellow fabric. But he never found a single trace of his brother Steve. The only thing Bob did find during his year-long search was the skeletal remains of another hiker. This was a person who had gone missing on the mountain 3 years earlier. No one had been able to find him. Bob was able to recover those remains and bring closure to that missing hiker's family. But as for his own brother, there was nothing. This brings us to some very strange questions. How could Bob, who searched 2,500 miles and summited the mountain 600 times, miss his brother? Steve was wearing a bright yellow rain jacket. That jacket would not decompose in a year. It would have stood out like a beacon against the gray rocks and green trees. If Steve's body was on that mountain, Bob or the search dogs should have found him. And then there is the question of the dog. Why was that highly energetic trail dog so terrified that night? What was outside of the tents that made the dog cower in fear and refuse to help its owner? Dogs have senses that are far sharper than ours. They can smell and hear things we cannot. The dog clearly sensed something in the dark. Something that was close to the camp. Something that was terrifying. And why did Steve feel such an overwhelming urge to walk up that trail alone in the first place, leaving all of his survival gear behind? When we look at these three cases together, we start to see some truly bizarre patterns. These are the patterns that David Paulides writes about in his Missing 411 books. First, look at the victims. Kevin O'Keefe, Patrick Whalen, and Stephen Thomas. They were not inexperienced tourists. They were not people who got lost because they did not know how to read a map. Kevin took a wilderness survival class specifically for Alaska. Pat was a seasoned survivalist who had hiked thousands of miles on the Pacific Crest Trail. Steve was an experienced mountain hiker who had tackled rough terrain in Washington. These were men who knew the dangers of the woods. They knew that leaving your gear behind is a fatal mistake. Yet, all three of them did exactly that. Kevin left his fully packed backpack by a tree. Pat left his gear inside his zipped tent. Steve left his pack in Bruce's tent. Second, look at the tents. In both Kevin's case and Pat's case, the main support strut of their tents was broken or collapsed. A tent strut does not just break on its own unless there is extreme wind, but in both cases, the weather had not been bad enough to cause that kind of structural failure. It looked as if something had pushed down on the tents, or as if the tents had been grabbed. Third, look at the food. In the wilderness, food is gold to wild animals. If you leave food out in the open in Alaska or Montana, it will be gone in hours. Bears, wolves, and rodents will smell it and find it. But in Kevin's case, his food was left out in the open and remained completely untouched. In Pat's case, his food was inside a tent for 6 months and no animals ever ripped the tent to get to it. It is as if the local wildlife was actively avoiding these campsites. This is a huge red flag. Animals avoid areas where they feel a dominant, terrifying presence. And finally, look at the hints of a threat. Pat Whalen's empty knife sheath suggests he heard something so threatening that he drew his knife and stepped outside to face it. The dog on Mount Marcy was so terrified of whatever was outside the tent that it cowered and whimpered. If we try to reconstruct what actually happened to these men, we have to look past these standard explanations. The authorities wanted to believe these were simple accidents. They wanted to believe Kevin fell in a gully, Pat got lost, and Steve froze in a crevice. But the evidence does not support those theories. If Kevin fell into a gully, why were his boots, hat, and glove liner found neatly tucked away in that gully half a mile from his camp while his body was nowhere to be found? Why would he walk half a mile barefoot over rough Alaskan terrain? It is physically impossible to do that without destroying your feet, yet his boots were found clean and undamaged. Did something carry him there? Did something force him to take his boots off? If Pat got lost, why did he leave all his gear, including his boots, inside his zip tent? A survivalist does not wander off into the Montana woods barefoot without his gear. He stepped outside with his knife to face something. Whatever it was, it took him. It took him without a struggle, without leaving a drop of blood, and without disturbing the tent. If Steve froze in a crevice on Mount Marcy, why did his brother, who searched 2,500 miles, never find a single thread of his bright yellow jacket? Why did the dog cower in fear? There are many theories about what is happening in these deep forests. Some people believe there are wild, feral humans living in the remote areas of our national parks. They believe these people have lived off the grid for generations and they hunt campers for survival. They know the terrain perfectly. They know how to move without leaving tracks. They know how to ambush someone silently. Others believe there are predators in the woods that science has not yet discovered. They talk about legendary creatures like Bigfoot or Sasquatch. They point to the broken tent struts, the heavy objects being moved, and the way search dogs refuse to track the scent. They say that animals are terrified of these creatures, which would explain why no wildlife came near Kevin's or Pat's campsites to eat the food. And then there are those who believe in even stranger things. They talk about portals or tears in space and time. They believe that under certain conditions, people walk off a trail and simply slip into another dimension. This would explain why people disappear in a second and why their bodies are sometimes found in areas that had been searched by hundreds of people multiple times. We will likely never know the truth. The government and the Park Service continue to remain silent about these disappearances. They do not want to scare the public. They do not want people to stop visiting the parks. But the files remain open. The aftermath of these disappearances is a heavy, lingering grief. For the families of Kevin, Pat, and Steve, there is no closure. There is no grave to visit. There are no answers. They are left with a permanent void in their lives. They are left with the haunting knowledge that their loved ones went into the beautiful, peaceful woods and encountered something so terrifying that they were never seen again. When you go into the deep woods, it is easy to feel small. You look up at the giant trees and you realize how massive the wilderness is. You feel a sense of awe. But the next time you are out there and the sun starts to go down and the forest gets quiet, pay attention. Listen to the wind. Look at the shadows. If the birds suddenly stop singing and the woods go completely silent, remember these stories. Remember that you might not be as alone as you think. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Just before midnight on the 20th of August, 2012, a 19-year-old college student named Rosem and her best friend, 19-year-old Elizabeth Nass, walked down Main Street in their quiet hometown of Ellicott City, Maryland. It was their last night together before they each would pack up their things, say goodbye to their families, and head back to college in separate states. They had spent the entire summer together, hanging out, laughing, and making memories. They knew that once they went back to school, they would be separated by hundreds of miles and busy schedules, so they wanted to make this last night count. To cap off what had felt like an absolutely perfect summer, they decided to grab a few beers, even though they were underage, and head over to their favorite hangout spot. This spot was a train trestle that ran over Main Street. Now, to be clear, this train trestle was not some secret daredevil hideout spot. Lots of people in town knew about it. Lots of kids, including Rosem and Elizabeth Nass, had been up there many, many times before. It was a popular local landmark where teenagers would gather to talk and look at the beautiful lights of the town below. And while there was an active train track that ran across it, the concrete ledge on the trestle where everybody would sit when they were up there was several feet away from the tracks, safely out of the way of any passing trains. You could sit up there on the ledge, look down over the town, and a train could literally pass right by you on the tracks and not affect you at all. So overall, the girls felt it was completely safe to climb up and sit there. So Elizabeth Nass and Rosem climbed up onto the train trestle and took their usual seats along the concrete ledge, safely away from the tracks. They cracked open their beers and began talking about their upcoming college semesters. They talked about which classes they were going to take, what they were looking forward to, and really how much they were going to miss each other. They laughed about old memories from high school and made plans for how they would visit each other during the holidays. Then, at some point, Rosem pulled out her phone and took a photo of her and Elizabeth Nass's feet dangling off the trestle. The photo captured their feet hovering over Main Street with the quiet town lights glowing down below. She quickly posted that photo to Twitter. But as soon as she hit the post button, she and Elizabeth Nass heard a loud screeching sound coming from right behind them. When they turned around to see what it was, something huge smashed into them, and then everything went black. That loud screeching sound was the sound of a train passing by right behind them. But remember, the tracks are set far enough back that the train itself could not hit them. And in this case, the train was not the thing that hit these two girls. Instead, it was something truly unfortunate and rare that happened. When that train passed by the girls, it partially derailed. It was not a full-scale derailment with cars going everywhere off the tracks, but instead, several of these cargo cars toppled over onto their sides. Some of those cars that toppled over were open cars, carrying thousands of pounds of heavy coal. As the cars toppled, all of this coal spilled out, smashing into Rosem and Elizabeth Nass and fully burying them. It was like they were under an avalanche of coal. By the time they were pulled out from under the coal, they were already dead. Rosem and Elizabeth Nass were the only two fatalities from this derailment. Their families would later sue the railroad company, alleging negligence, and each family would receive a settlement, though the exact amounts were never disclosed. The news of the tragic accident quickly spread through the tight-knit community of Ellicott City, leaving everyone in a state of shock and disbelief. Rosem and Elizabeth Nass were well-known and incredibly loved by their peers, teachers, and neighbors. A makeshift memorial of flowers, candles, and handwritten notes quickly began to grow near the base of the train trestle as people struggled to make sense of how a simple summer night could end in such an unimaginable disaster. The tragedy sparked intense local debates about safety measures around active railroad lines and whether more should be done to restrict access to landmarks like the trestle. But for the families of the two young women, no amount of safety discussions or legal settlements could ever fill the massive void left by their sudden loss. They were forced to face the upcoming autumn not by sending their daughters off to college, but by holding funerals. It was a stark and haunting reminder of how quickly life can change in the most unexpected way. Before we move on to our next story, I want to take a moment to thank BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. June is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month, and in honor of that, I wanted to share a quick personal story about my own mental health journey. Back in 2017, I got out of the military after serving for several years. When I transitioned back to civilian life, I went through a major identity crisis. So much of who I was, my entire purpose and sense of self, was wrapped up in being a Navy SEAL. But now that I was out on the other side, it felt like I did not know who I was anymore. I did not even know what kind of job to get, or really what to do with my life. It was this intense existential crisis that quickly sent me into a very dark and depressing spiral. But instead of seeking help or telling anybody about what I was going through, I kept it all bottled up inside. I began lashing out at my family and my friends, and I was just being a complete downer everywhere I went. I was pushed away from the people who cared about me the most. It was not until my family and friends, because they loved me so much, stepped in and confronted me. They told me that I really needed to see someone. That was the moment I finally understood the negative impact I was having on other people and just how bad things had gotten for me personally. And so, I decided to go out and speak to a therapist. At first, I admit I was not sold on the idea. I did not think this was going to be a big solution for me. But pretty quickly, having that neutral third party to bounce ideas off of and gain new perspective from really changed my life. It set me on a course to where I am happy today. I still see a therapist to this day, and it is therapy that got me to this place right now. This emotional equilibrium I have reached is because of therapy. So, if you are struggling right now, I would highly suggest thinking about therapy as an option for you. And a great starting point for therapy is BetterHelp. It is incredibly convenient, primarily because it is entirely online. This makes it so easy and accessible. All you have to do is fill out a quick, simple survey online, and then within 2 days, they will pair you up with a licensed professional therapist. And if for any reason you want to change your therapist, you can do that at any time at absolutely no additional cost. You can click the link in the description below or go to betterhelp.com/mrbballen to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Again, that is betterhelp.com/Mr. to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Now, let us get back to our stories. At 6 p.m. on the 27th of October 2014, a 17-year-old boy named Jesus Menes was playing basketball with a group of friends on an outdoor basketball court at Kinloch Park in Miami, Florida. The friends had broken up into two teams and were in the middle of a very intense pickup game. The game was pretty close, and Jesus Menes' team was doing really well. They were running up and down the court, sweating in the warm Florida evening heat, completely focused on winning. But at some point, when Jesus Menes and his team had possession of the ball, one of his teammates just got frazzled by the defense and took a crazy three-point shot from way behind the line. The ball sailed right past the hoop, completely missing it, a total air ball, and it bounced and then went clean over a chain-link fence on the edge of the park. As soon as this happened, Jesus Menes and all of his friends let out a collective groan because they knew basically anything that went over that fence was pretty much gone forever. But to Jesus Menes' surprise, one of his friends turned to Jesus Menes and was like, "Hey, why don't you just hop the fence and go get the ball?" Now, Jesus Menes really did not want to do that. He had been coming to this park since he was a small toddler with his family, and his mom and dad had always told him to never ever climb that fence. Never. But now, Jesus Menes' friend had turned it into a dare, saying, "Come on, Jesus, hop the fence and get the ball." The other friends picked up on this and started egging him on, saying, "Yeah, Jesus, go over there and get the ball." Jesus Menes knew this was not a good idea, but surrounded by all of his peers, he didn't want to look weak or scared. He thought to himself, what is the worst that could happen? And said, "All right, I will go get it." Jesus Menes left the basketball court and walked over to this fence, which was about 7 feet tall, with sharp barbed wire across the top of it. He turned back around, and his friends were all smiling and cheering him on. So, he began climbing the fence. He reached the top, positioned himself carefully over the barbed wire to avoid cutting himself, and tumbled down to the other side. He hit the ground pretty hard, but stood up, realized he was okay, and looked through the fence at his cheering friends. Jesus Menes was feeling very confident and smiled at them like a hero. He turned around, picked up the basketball, and chucked it back over the fence to his friends. He was about to climb back over when he noticed another basketball that someone else had lost over this fence. Except this basketball was on the other side of a second fence. Basically, once you climb the first fence, a couple of feet later, there is a second fence. These were the two fences that Jesus Menes and everyone who came to this park were warned about. Never climb them. But Jesus Menes had already climbed the first one, got his basketball, and thought he could climb the second one too to get a backup ball. He figured it would be an easy way to get another ball for their games. So, without even telling his friends, Jesus Menes walked over to the second fence, which was identical to the first one, carefully climbed to the top, positioned himself over the barbed wire, and dropped down to the other side. But within seconds of Jesus Menes landing inside of that second fenced-in area, something absolutely horrible happened. His friends back on the court saw what was going on and began totally panicking. They were screaming, running around, and did not know what to do. Eventually, one of them called 911. Minutes later, first responders showed up and found the teenagers completely frantic, pointing toward the fenced-in areas. The first responders looked and knew right away there was virtually nothing they could do to save Jesus Menes. The reason these fences were totally off-limits, and the reason Jesus Menes' family had warned him to never climb them, was because inside of that second fenced-in area was an electrical power grid. There were warning signs all over the fences, but Jesus Menes had ignored them. When he landed inside of that second area, he stepped directly on a live electrical wire. The second he did, 500,000 volts of electricity coursed through his body. For reference, the average lightning bolt contains about 300,000 volts of electricity. When Jesus Menes hit that wire, it was the equivalent of 2 lightning bolts striking him at once, over and over again. Jesus Manis died almost immediately from the massive electrical shock. In the days following the incident, Kinloch Park was filled with grief as classmates, family members, and local residents came to pay their respects to Jesus Manis. A beautiful memorial was set up right by the basketball court where he had spent so much of his life. People left basketballs, signed jerseys, and wrote heartfelt messages on the pavement, mourning the loss of a bright, energetic young man who had his whole life ahead of him. The power company that operated the electrical substation immediately launched an investigation into how the tragedy occurred, ultimately reiterating the importance of the warning signs and the physical barriers that had been put in place to protect the public. The tragedy served as a somber and permanent warning to all the kids in the neighborhood about the invisible, deadly dangers that lay just beyond those chain-link fences. For Jesus Manis's family, the park would never be the same, and they were left with a permanent hole in their hearts. On the afternoon of the 22nd of April 2023, a 49-year-old father of three named Carlo Keefe crawled through a cave system in Cumbria, England. He was on his hands and knees, slowly shuffling his way forward, and the only light guiding him through the dark tunnel was the small headlamp on his helmet. Now, Carlo Keefe was an adventurer who loved rock climbing and exploring caves, but this particular cave system was one he was not that familiar with. He had only been here a couple of other times and did not have a map with him, so he did not actually know where he was going. But Carlo Keefe was not remotely worried because he knew this was easily the safest cave system he had ever explored. In fact, this place was so safe that families regularly showed up with their kids and let them run around freely with no fear they would get hurt. Carlo Keefe had no worries, and he could still hear the other people and their kids playing and laughing just behind him in the entrance area. Even though he did not really know where he was or where the tunnel led, he felt completely fine and was just enjoying the adventure. He was completely alone in the narrow passage, feeling the air. Carlo Keefe continued crawling through this tunnel and eventually reached a T-intersection where he had to choose between going right or left. Since he had no map, he decided to just go right. He began going down this tunnel, which closely resembled the first one. But as he crawled along, he started to feel like the walls around him were shrinking, and it was getting harder to push his body forward. Finally, when it felt so tight and claustrophobic that he realized he should just turn around, he reached a dead end. Since he could not go further, Carlo Keefe decided he would make a U-turn with his body to go back the way he came. He was on his hands and knees, facing the dead end. The tunnel was incredibly pitch black and quiet, with only the distant sound of children echoing from far away. Carlo Keefe tried to shimmy at himself one way or the other, but it was like no matter what he did, he just could not move out of this U-shape. His heart rate began to rise, and it became much harder to breathe. It felt like the walls of this cave were pressing down on him, and he became overwhelmingly claustrophobic. He began to panic and started screaming out for help. Immediately, some of the staff who heard him yelling made their way into the tunnel system and saw Carlo Keefe wedged there. When they tried to pull him out by his feet, they could not get him to move at all. Sensing a true emergency, the staff backed out and called the fire department. The firefighters came out, but they too could not get Carlo Keefe out of the tight space. He was completely stuck. All Carlo Keefe could do was try to stay calm and take measured breaths to avoid restricting his breathing even more. He kept thinking the rescue team would get him out quickly, but to his shock and the shock of the first responders, it would take an agonizing 4 hours to finally free him. During those 4 hours, Carlo Keefe grew weaker and more panicked as his muscles were crushed. The instant he was freed, he was rushed to the hospital and admitted to the intensive care unit. At the hospital, the doctors discovered that Carlo Keefe had suffered extensive, severe crush injuries from being trapped in that position for so long. He had severe bone damage, organ damage, and nerve damage throughout his body. Despite heroic efforts by the medical staff to save him, Carlo Keefe died 8 days later from his injuries. His death became massive national news because it seemed completely impossible that someone could die in a cave system designed to be so safe. But the reason it was so safe was because this was not a real, natural, underground cave system. It was an indoor play center for children. The entire cave system was constructed out of molded plastic tunnels meant for kids to crawl around in during birthday parties. Adults were told they could also go through the tunnels with their kids. Carl O'Keefe had gone to a birthday party for one of his children's friends and brought his kids along. Being the devoted father that he was, he had gone right into the tunnels to play with them, never imagining that a harmless children's toy would end up claiming his life. In the wake of his passing, the play center closed the cave attraction permanently, and local authorities launched a comprehensive review of safety standards for indoor adventure parks, hoping to ensure that no other family would ever have to endure such a shocking and preventable tragedy. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.